March 15, 1881. The cold reality of wealth in the Arizona Territory was not the shine of a coin, but the dead, unyielding heaviness of the bullion bars sitting on the reinforced floorboards of the Wells Fargo office in Tombstone. These ingots were ugly, blocky things cast from the violent geology of the San Pedro Valley, stripped from the rock by pickaxes, crushed by stamps, and melted down into dense loaves of monetary value that required two hands and a strained back to lift. On this Tuesday afternoon, the air inside the express office smelled of stale tobacco smoke, dry pine, and the metallic tang of the silver that dominated the room's attention. The shipment scheduled for the afternoon run to Benson was massive, a hoard that would draw attention from every desperate set of eyes in the county if they knew the specific tally. $26,000 in silver bullion waited for transport, a fortune that could buy a ranch, a saloon, or a dozen lives without making a dent in the total mass. The physical presence of the silver was overwhelming. Each bar was a concentrated slab of labor and geology, stamped with the mark of the assayer and the weight in troy ounces. The surfaces were dull and pitted, lacking the polish of finished jewelry, but possessing a gravitational pull that warped the behavior of men around them. To move a single bar required a deliberate engagement of the legs and core. The clerks handling the manifest treated the stack with a reverence reserved for high explosives or religious artifacts. This was not paper currency that could flutter away in a gust of wind. This was wealth solidified into a weapon of blunt force. The sheer density of the shipment meant that the transport vehicle would be carrying hundreds of pounds of dead weight in addition to the passengers and luggage, altering the physics of how the carriage would handle the ruts and turns of the road ahead. Outside on Allen Street, the instrument of transport waited. It was a Concord coach, a masterpiece of 19th-century American engineering built by the Abbott Downing Company of Concord, New Hampshire. This vehicle was not a rigid wagon, but a complex system of suspension and balance designed to survive the brutal topography of the frontier. The body of the coach was constructed from seasoned basswood and poplar, chosen for their resistance to splintering, while the framing relied on white ash, a wood known for its ability to absorb shock without snapping. The panels were curved, not just for aesthetics, but to deflect the wind and add structural integrity to the shell. It was painted in the distinctive red and yellow livery that signaled its purpose. But beneath the paint lay a skeleton of iron bracing and hardwood capable of withstanding rollover impacts and high-velocity collisions. The most critical feature of the Concord coach, and the one that would dictate the events of the coming hours, was the suspension system. Unlike European carriages that rested on steel springs, the Concord body was suspended on thoroughbraces. These were massive, multi-layered straps of cured leather, thick as a man's thigh, running lengthwise beneath the carriage. The coach body literally hung from these straps, swinging back and forth like a cradle. This design allowed the vehicle to rock violently over boulders and washouts without transferring the full impact to the chassis or the horses. It turned a jarring, bone-breaking ride into a rhythmic, nauseating sway. Today, those leather braces would be tested to their limit, groaning under the combined load of the silver bullion and the frantic energy of a flight for survival. The wheels of the coach were their own marvel of durability. Standing nearly 5 feet high in the rear and slightly shorter in the front, they were built of second-growth hickory, a wood so dense it ruined saw blades. The spokes were fitted into the hub with mathematical precision, angled slightly outward in a dish shape to absorb lateral thrust during sharp turns. Encircling the wooden felloes were tires of iron, heated and shrunk onto the wood to bind the entire wheel into a single indestructible unit. As the coach sat idling in the dust of Tombstone, the iron tires were already warm from the friction of the arrival trip, ready to grind against the rocks of the contention road. The grease in the axle boxes was thick and black, a mixture of animal fat and pine tar that kept the wheels turning even when submerged in sand or mud. The team of horses selected for this run stood patiently in their harness, swatting flies with their tails. 6 animals were hitched to the rig, arranged in 3 pairs: the leaders, the swings, and the wheelers. The wheelers, the pair closest to the coach, were the largest and strongest, responsible for braking and steering the heavy vehicle. The swing team in the middle provided the pulling power, while the leaders out front set the pace and direction. These were not delicate racing animals. They were muscled laborers fed on high-calorie grain to maintain their stamina over the grueling miles between stations. Their coats were dusted with the gray powder of the street, and the leather of their harnesses creaked with every shift of weight. The brass fittings on their bridles glinted in the afternoon sun, a deceptive bit of polish on a brutal industrial machine. Bud Philpott, the driver assigned to this run, walked around the rig with the critical eye of a ship's captain inspecting a hull. Philpott was a man who understood the language of the reins and the temperament of the road. He checked the traces, ensuring the leather was supple and free of cracks. He kicked the brake lever, a long iron bar that pressed a wooden block against the rear wheels. The friction of wood on iron was the only thing standing between a controlled descent and a runaway disaster on the steep grades of the Dragoon Mountains. Philpott knew that with the extra weight of the silver, the stopping distance of the coach would be significantly increased. The inertia of $26,000 in metal would push the coach forward with terrifying persistence, fighting against the friction of the brakes. Standing nearby was Bob Paul, the Wells Fargo shotgun messenger. Paul was a figure of authority, a man whose physical size matched the job description. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the ease of someone who had seen violence and survived it. His weapon of choice was a short-barreled shotgun, a tool designed for close-quarters devastation. He did not rely on intimidation alone. He checked the mechanism of the gun, breaking the breech to ensure the barrels were clear. The ammunition he carried was not birdshot but heavy buckshot, large pellets of soft metal designed to tear through wood and flesh with equal indifference. Paul watched the street, his eyes scanning the porches and alleyways, processing the baseline activity of the town to identify any anomalies. The loading process began, a labor-intensive ritual of securing the cargo. The station agents brought the bullion out, grunting with the effort. They did not toss the bars, they placed them. Some went into the boot, the leather-covered luggage compartment at the rear of the coach, while others were stowed directly under the seats inside the cabin to distribute the weight. The center of gravity had to be kept low. If the coach became top-heavy, the swinging motion of the thoroughbraces could amplify into a rollover during a high-speed turn. Philpott supervised the placement, ordering a shift of a few inches here or there to ensure the rig sat level. The leather straps groaned as the weight settled, the carriage body sinking lower toward the axles. The interior of the coach was a tight, utilitarian space. 3 bench seats were upholstered in leather and padded with horsehair, offering minimal comfort against the jolts of the road. The space was designed for 9 passengers, 3 on each bench, knees interlocking in a cramped puzzle of limbs. With the bullion crates occupying foot space, the legroom was further restricted. The windows were open rectangles fitted with heavy leather curtains that could be rolled down to block dust or rain, though they offered zero protection against projectiles. The walls were thin paneling, offering privacy but no ballistic shield. A passenger sitting inside was essentially traveling in a wooden crate suspended by straps, blind to the outside world except for the small rectangles of light. Tombstone surrounding them was a hive of noise and commerce. The clatter of boots on boardwalks, the shouting of hawkers, and the distant rhythm of stamp mills crushing ore created a constant sonic backdrop. The town was at its peak, a place where money flowed as freely as the whiskey, and the line between lawman and outlaw was often a matter of which side of the street one stood on. The sheer volume of silver moving out of the district was public knowledge. Everyone knew the stages carried the wealth of the mines. The schedule was regular, the route was fixed, and the terrain offered 100 places where the advantage lay with the ambusher. Philpott and Paul operated with the grim acceptance of this tactical disadvantage. They were moving a target through a shooting gallery, relying on speed and firepower to deter aggression. As the loading concluded, the suspension of the coach was compressed. The leather thoroughbraces pulled taut under the thousands of pounds of combined mass. The vehicle looked heavy, sitting squat on its wheels. Philpott climbed up to the box, the driver's seat located high above the front axle. From this perch, he had a commanding view of the road and the backs of his 6 horses. He gathered the ribbons, the long leather reins threading them through his fingers in a specific order that allowed him to communicate individually with each pair of animals. The reins were his connection to the engine of the vehicle. A subtle twitch of the pinky finger could signal a turn, while a firm pull engaged the brakes. Bob Paul climbed up beside him, taking the shotgun seat. The position was named literally. He sat on the left, the side from which he could best cover the road and the driver. He placed his shotgun across his lap, the barrels pointing skyward and away from the horses. His pockets were heavy with extra cartridges. The view from the box was exposed. There was no windshield, no dashboard, nothing to stop a bullet or an arrow. They were elevated targets, silhouetted against the sky for anyone hiding in the scrub brush. Paul adjusted his hat, pulling the brim down to shield his eyes from the glare. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows that would eventually stretch into the twilight where danger thrived. The passengers began to board. Among them was Peter Rurig, a man whose ticket had just bought him a seat in a vessel destined for violence. He climbed into the dark interior, settling onto the cushions. The smell inside was a mix of old leather and dust. He was joined by others, strangers thrown together for the duration of the journey to Benson. They adjusted their coats, stowed their small bags, and prepared for the monotony of the travel. None of them could see the bullion stowed beneath them, but they could feel the solidity of the ride, the lack of bounce that indicated a heavy load. The door was swung shut with a solid latching click, sealing them inside the wooden shell. Philpott released the brake with a harsh scrape of iron. He called out to the team, a sharp, guttural command that snapped the horses to attention. The leather traces tightened, snapping straight as the animals leaned into their collars. The wheels groaned, the grease cold and stiff before beginning to roll. The iron tires crunched over the gravel of Allen Street, the sound echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. The coach lurched forward, the thoroughbraces swinging, converting the forward momentum into a swaying rhythm. The journey had begun. They rolled past the OK Corral, past the saloons and the mercantile stores, heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to the open desert. The transition was stark. 1 minute they were in the center of civilization, surrounded by the structures of man. The next, they were in the wild, a landscape of mesquite, cactus, and rock. The road to Benson was a lifeline, a narrow ribbon of dirt carved into the hard earth, rutted by the passage of countless wagons. It wound through washes and over ridges, following the path of least resistance through a hostile geography. The weight of the silver bullion acted as an anchor, keeping the coach planted on the road but also demanding more from the horses. Philpott kept the pace steady, saving the animals' strength for the difficult sections ahead. He could feel the cargo in the way the coach handled. It was sluggish in the turns, wanting to push wide. He had to anticipate every curve, beginning his steering inputs early to coax the heavy mass into a new direction. It was a physical conversation between the driver and the laws of motion, mediated by leather and wood. As the buildings of Tombstone shrank behind them, the reality of their isolation set in. They were a single point of movement in a vast, static landscape. The desert was silent, save for the rhythmic pounding of 24 hooves and the rumble of the wheels. Bob Paul kept his head on a swivel, scanning the horizon. He looked for the unnatural shapes, the glint of metal, the dust cloud that didn't match the wind. He knew the route by heart, knew the choke points where the road narrowed and the cover was thick. Drew's station was miles ahead, a mere waypoint in the journey, but the intervening distance was filled with blind corners and dry washes. The sun beat down on the roof of the coach, heating the interior. Inside, the passengers swayed in unison, their bodies adjusting to the motion of the thoroughbraces. The conversation was sparse, limited by the noise of the travel. They were passive participants, cargo just like the silver, dependent entirely on the skill of the two men on the box. They trusted that the system, the company, the schedule, the law, would protect them. They did not know that the system was being targeted, that the very regularity of the stage schedule was the variable that made them vulnerable. The silver bullion remained dark and silent, hidden in the structure of the coach. It was the catalyst, the magnet drawing trouble toward them. It had no morality, no allegiance. It was simply mass and value, indifferent to who possessed it. Whether it sat in the vault of a bank or the saddlebags of a thief, the silver remained unchanged. But for the men on the coach, its presence defined the stakes. They were not just transporting metal, they were transporting the livelihood of the territory, the tangible result of the mining industry. Losing it was not an option. Philpott cracked his whip, not hitting the horses, but snapping the lash in the air above their heads, a sharp report like a pistol shot to encourage the leaders. The team picked up the pace, the iron tires singing a higher pitch on the hard-packed earth. The coach picked up speed, the swaying becoming more pronounced. The thoroughbraces creaked, stretching and contracting, absorbing the energy of the road. Dust billowed up behind them, a long beige tail marking their passage. The mechanics of the carriage were performing exactly as designed. The ash frame held rigid. The hickory spokes absorbed the shocks, and the iron tires resisted the abrasion of the rocks. It was a machine built for endurance, for the long haul. But it was not a tank. It was wood and leather, vulnerable to fire, to physics, and to projectiles. As they moved further from the safety of Tombstone, the protective bubble of the town vanished. They were now operating under the rules of the open range, where distance was measured in hours and help was non-existent. Bob Paul shifted in his seat, the shotgun resting easy in his hands. He was not nervous, but he was alert. The weight of the gun was familiar, a comfort. He knew the limitations of the weapon. It had a short, effective range. To use it, the enemy had to be close, within shouting distance. That meant if trouble came, it would be intimate. It would not be a long-range exchange of rifle fire. It would be a sudden, violent confrontation at point-blank range. He watched the scrub brush passing by, his eyes dissecting the shadows. The bullion rode silently beneath them, $26,000 of cold, hard danger. It was the reason for the trip, the reason for the guns, and the reason for the eyes that might be watching from the ridges ahead. The stagecoach rolled on, a red and yellow speck traversing the immense, indifferent landscape of the Arizona Territory, carrying a fortune in silver and a destiny of violence that was rapidly closing the distance. The geography of a robbery was dictated by the terrain, and the terrain south of Drew's station was engineered by geology to facilitate violence. 200 yards from the station buildings, the earth opened up in a dry wash, a jagged scar cut into the desert floor by centuries of flash floods. The wash ran perpendicular to the stage road, creating a natural trench that severed the flat approach. The road did not bridge this gap. It dipped down into the sandy bottom and climbed steeply out the other side. This depression was a tactical choke point. Any vehicle traversing it had to surrender its momentum. The horses would have to brake hard to descend the near bank, struggle through the deep sand of the wash floor, and then strain against their collars to haul the heavy load up the far bank. For a span of 30 seconds, the fastest stagecoach in the territory would be reduced to a crawling, struggling target. Bill Leonard stood in the bottom of this wash, his boots sinking slightly into the cooling sand. The sun had dropped below the horizon and the desert was reclaiming its heat, bleeding the temperature out into the clear night sky. Leonard was a man who understood the mechanics of an ambush. He did not choose this spot by accident. He chose it because the geometry of the ground stripped the driver of his options. Once the stage dipped its nose into the incline, there was no turning back, no room to maneuver, and no speed to outrun a bullet. The wash provided cover for the shooters, allowing them to remain invisible until the targets were within point-blank range. The banks of the wash were high enough to conceal a standing man, creating a natural parapet for rifle work. With Leonard were 3 other men, Harry Head, Jim Crane, and Luther King. They were a grim assembly dressed in the rough utilitarian clothing of the frontier range. Their coats were heavy wool and canvas buttoned tight against the dropping mercury. Dust coated every crease of their garments, blending them into the monochrome palette of the surrounding scrub. They were not drifting aimlessly. They were positioned with military precision. Head and Crane moved with the confident economy of men familiar with firearms. They checked their weapons, the metallic clicks of loading gates and levers sounding sharp in the stillness. The weaponry they carried was the standard arsenal of the Western outlaw, tools designed for reliability rather than finesse. Winchester repeating rifles were the primary instruments of the coming engagement. These rifles, with their tubular magazines running beneath the barrels, offered a volume of fire that single-shot muskets could never match. A man with a Winchester could put a dozen rounds into the air without taking the weapon from his shoulder. The ammunition was heavy, flat-nosed slugs designed to smash bone and drop large game. In the confined space of the wash, these rifles would function almost like artillery capable of punching through the wood of a coach or the chest of a horse with equal ease. Luther King occupied a different role in the hierarchy of the night. He was the horseholder, the man assigned to keep their escape mounts quiet and ready. He stood further back in the shadows, holding the reins of 4 horses. The animals were nervous, sensing the tension in the men. They shifted their weight, their hooves crunching softly on the gravel. King stroked their necks, whispering low, meaningless sounds to keep them calm. His job was critical but inglorious. If the shooting started, he had to ensure the getaway transportation did not bolt in panic. A robbery crew without horses was nothing more than a group of walking targets for a posse. King checked the cinches on the saddles, tightening them against the bellies of the animals. He ran his hands over the leather, ensuring no straps were twisted, no buckles loose. The preparation for the identity concealment was crude but effective. They did not rely on simple bandanas. They had fashioned masks, strange and unsettling disguises meant to distort their human features into something unrecognizable. Some accounts would later describe masks made of wig hair or rough cloth, designed to break up the outline of the face. The goal was not just anonymity, it was terror. A faceless gunman shouting commands from the darkness was a psychological weapon. It froze victims, creating a moment of hesitation that the robbers could exploit. They pulled these coverings down, testing the fit, ensuring the eye holes aligned with their vision. The world narrowed to the tunnel view through the rough openings. The ambush site was silent. The desert at night was not truly quiet, but the sounds were small. The scuttle of a beetle, the rustle of a rodent in the mesquite. The men added nothing to this soundscape. They did not speak. The plan had been discussed and agreed upon hours ago. There was nothing left to say. They knew the schedule. The stage from Tombstone was due. They knew the cargo, The bullion shipment was the prize that justified the risk of a hanging rope. They were not here for the pocket change of the passengers. They were here for the heavy silver bars that would set them up for life. Bill Leonard moved to his position on the bank. He checked the sight lines. From where he stood, he could see the silhouette of the road against the slightly lighter sky. He visualized the stage appearing at the crest. First the ears of the leaders, then the driver on the box, and finally the bulk of the coach. He raised his rifle, tracking the imaginary path. The range was incredibly short, less than 20 yards. At that distance, missing was difficult. The challenge was not hitting the target. The challenge was controlling the chaos that would erupt the moment they revealed themselves. Harry Head took the opposite side. They were setting up a crossfire, or at least a convergence of angles. If the driver tried to lean away from one shooter, he would expose himself to the other. They were creating a kill box where the air would be filled with flying metal. Head checked his pockets, ensuring he had extra cartridges easily accessible. In a running fight, there was no time to dig for ammunition. It had to be ready to grab by touch alone. The brass casings were cold against his fingers. He wiped his palms on his trousers, removing the sweat of anticipation. Jim Crane settled into the brush, his body low to the ground. He was the backup, the enforcer. If the stage didn't stop, if the driver tried to run them down, Crane was ready to target the horses. Shooting a horse was a brutal tactic, but it was effective. A dead horse in the traces acted as a literal anchor, 1,000 pounds of dead weight that would drag the entire team to a halt. It created a tangle of harness and limbs that no driver could untangle under fire. Crane knew the anatomy of the animals. He knew where to place the shot to drop a wheeler instantly. The environment around them was hostile in its own right. The vegetation consisted of creosote bush, ocotillo, and prickly pear cactus. Every plant carried thorns or spines. Moving through the brush required care to avoid tearing clothes or skin. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks that could twist an ankle in the dark. The men had memorized the few square yards of their immediate operating area. They cleared away loose stones from under their feet to ensure a stable shooting stance. A slip at the wrong moment could send a shot wide or delay a critical action. The temperature continued to drop. The desert floor radiated its stored heat quickly, and the dry air offered no insulation. The men blew into their cupped hands to keep their fingers dexterous. Numb fingers could fumble a trigger or bungle a reload. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, keeping the blood circulating. The cold added a physical edge to the mental tension. It made the muscles tight, the senses sharp. They listened for the specific acoustic signature of the stagecoach. It would not be a subtle sound. The iron tires on rock, the thud of hooves, and the creak of leather would announce the arrival long before the vehicle became visible. Luther King watched the others from his position with the horses. He was the outlier, the one not on the firing line. His nerves were different. He wasn't staring down a barrel, he was staring at the possibility of failure. If the stage didn't stop, if the guard returned fire and dropped one of the boys, King would have to make a split-second decision. Did he ride in to help, or did he cut and run? He held the reins tight, his knuckles white. The horses chewed on their bits, the metal clinking softly. King shooshed them, a desperate hiss. Silence was their armor until the trap was sprung. The plan relied on the element of surprise. They would not fire immediately. The protocol of the road agent was to command a halt. "Hold!" or "Halt!" shouted from the darkness was often enough. Most drivers, facing the muzzle of a Winchester at 10 paces, would pull back the ribbons and surrender. It was a business transaction, the strongbox for their lives. The Outlaws counted on this rationality. They did not want a gunfight. A gunfight was messy and dangerous. They wanted a submission. They wanted the driver to see the futility of resistance and kick down the box. but they were prepared for the irrationality of bravery. If the driver reached for a gun or whipped the horses, the verbal command would be instantly replaced by a volley of rifle fire. Leonard checked the position of the moon. It provided enough light to see outlines but not details. This was perfect for them. It obscured their numbers and their identities while highlighting the stage against the skyline. They were wraiths in the shadows, while the stage would be an illuminated target. The unfairness of the fight was the point. Fair fights were for fools and corpses. Successful robberies were built on overwhelming advantage. The waiting was the hardest part of the profession. The adrenaline spiked too early, then faded, leaving a residue of jitters. The mind began to play tricks, interpreting the sound of the wind as approaching wheels. Every shadow seemed to move. The men forced themselves to remain still to conserve their energy. They breathed slowly, regulating their heart rates. They were predators in a blind, waiting for the prey to walk into the clearing. The morality of the act did not enter into the equation. They were men who had decided that the laws of property did not apply to them, or at least that the silver belonged to whoever had the strength to take it. The wash itself seemed to wait with them. The sand, the rocks, the dry brush, everything was suspended in the amber of the moment. The history of this specific patch of ground was about to be written in gunpowder and blood. For thousands of years, only water had rushed through this channel. Tonight it would be violence. The geological features, the steep banks, the soft bottom, were neutral participants, but they would shape the outcome as surely as the men themselves. Harry had adjusted his mask again. The rough material scratched his skin. It was uncomfortable, hot and stifling despite the cold air. But it was necessary. If they pulled this off and rode away, they needed to be able to walk into a saloon in Tombstone or Bisbee the next day without being recognized. The mask was their ticket back to normal life. Without it, they were fugitives forever. With it, they were just men with money. He peered through the eye slits, his vision restricted. He had to turn his whole head to scan the area. This tunnel vision focused him. There was only the road, the kill zone. Jim Crane ran a thumb over the hammer of his rifle. It was at half cock, a safety position. When the time came, he would thumb it all the way back, a motion that took a fraction of a second. The weapon was an extension of his will. He trusted it more than he trusted the other men. A rifle didn't panic. A rifle didn't hesitate. It simply did what it was told. He rested the barrel in the crook of his arm, keeping the muzzle out of the dirt. A plugged barrel could explode, killing the shooter instead of the target. Luther King checked the perimeter. He looked back the way they had come, ensuring no one was trailing them. Paranoid vigilance was a survival trait. The desert was big, but trails were easy to follow if you knew what to look for. Tonight, the darkness hid their tracks. They were ghosts until they chose to be flesh. He patted the neck of the nearest horse, feeling the warm pulse of the animal. It was a living thing in a dead landscape, a reminder of the biological reality of the night. The stars overhead were brilliant, a dense canopy of light that offered no judgment. The constellation of Orion hunted in the sky, a celestial mirror to the men in the wash. The universe was vast and cold, and the events in the dry wash were infinitesimally small in comparison. Yet to the men waiting, this moment was the entirety of existence. The past was gone. The future was contingent on the next 10 minutes. Bill Leonard signaled to the others. He had heard something, a vibration in the ground, a faint rhythmic thumping. It was not the wind. It was the heavy, coordinated impact of a team of horses at a trot. The sound grew steadily, accompanied by the grinding of iron tires. The stage was coming. The waiting was over. The theoretical ambush was about to become a kinetic reality. The men stiffened. They moved to their final positions, planting their feet. They raised their rifles, the stocks pressing into their shoulders. The metal was cold against their cheeks. They controlled their breathing, taking shallow, quiet breaths. The silence in the wash deepened, becoming a heavy, pressurized thing. The noise of the approaching stage grew louder. The jingle of harness, chains, the creak of wood, the snort of a horse. It was a cacophony of life approaching the zone of death. Leonard watched the crest of the hill. The moonlight caught the dust rising from the road. The target was seconds away. He visualized the driver, the messenger, the passengers. He did not know their names or their faces. They were just obstacles and potential threats. His finger rested on the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger. Discipline was key. They had to let the stage get into the bottom of the wash, into the deep sand where it couldn't run. Timing was everything. The leaders of the stage team crested the hill. They were dark shapes against the stars, their heads bobbing. Then the rest of the team appeared, followed by the high, boxy shape of the Concorde coach. It looked massive, a rolling fortress. Leonard watched it tip forward as it began the descent. The brakes screeched, a piercing sound that tore through the night. The driver was riding the brake lever, fighting the gravity that pulled the heavy vehicle down the slope. The outlaws in the wash stood like statues. They let the horses come down. They let the coach commit to the descent. The noise was deafening now. The crunch of rocks, the heavy breathing of the animals. The smell of dust and horse sweat rolled down into the wash, preceding the vehicle. The stage hit the bottom, the wheels sinking into the soft sand. The momentum died. The horses strained, their rhythm breaking as they fought the drag. This was the moment. The trap was shut. The stage was in the kill zone, surrounded by high banks and armed men. The velocity was zero. The advantage was absolute. Bill Leonard stepped out from the shadow of the bank, his rifle leveled at the dark figure on the driver's box. The others stepped out with him, a line of armed shadows materializing from the earth. The silence of the wait was shattered by the shout that would begin the nightmare. Halt! The word hung in the cold air, a single syllable that severed the timeline, separating the mundane journey from the violence that was now inevitable. The men behind the guns were no longer waiting. They were acting. The potential energy of the ambush had just been converted into kinetic intent. The kill zone was active. The heavy Concorde coach cleared the final structures of Tombstone, the iron tires transitioning from the graded gravel of the town streets to the harder, irregular surface of the open road. It was late afternoon, the sun positioning itself for its descent behind the Whetstone Mountains to the west. Bud Philpott sat on the right side of the box, his gloved hands weaving the leather ribbons that controlled the 6-horse team. He did not grip the reins with tension, but held them with a practiced firmness, feeling the mouths of the animals through the long strips of leather. The team was fresh, their energy high, pulling against the traces with a unified rhythm that transmitted a surging vibration through the chassis of the vehicle. Beside him, Bob Paul occupied the messenger's seat on the left, his large frame absorbing the sway of the coach. The shotgun rested across his knees, the barrels cool to the touch, a constant physical reminder of his purpose on this run. The road to Benson was a known quantity to both men, a 25-mile stretch of dirt that demanded constant attention. It was not a flat, straight line, but a tortuous path that navigated the contours of the high desert. Every rut, every washout, and every protruding rock was a potential hazard that could snap an axle or throw a horse. Philpott scanned the ground ahead, his eyes reading the terrain 50 feet in front of the leaders. He made micro-adjustments to the steering, guiding the team around the worst of the obstacles. The coach responded sluggishly to his inputs, the massive weight of the silver bullion located beneath the floorboards acting as a keel that resisted rapid changes in direction. The vehicle plowed through the sand rather than gliding over it, the wheels grinding a deep track into the earth. Inside the coach, the passengers were subjected to a violent acoustic environment. The wooden shell amplified the noise of the road, the grinding of iron on stone, the creaking of the ash frame, and the rhythmic thudding of hooves. Dust, kicked up by the 24 hooves of the team, curled into the cabin through the gaps in the leather curtains, coating the interior with a fine, gritty powder. It settled on the clothes of the travelers, stuck to their sweat, and filled their nostrils with the scent of the dry Arizona earth. The suspension system, while advanced for its time, could not eliminate the vertical impacts of the rough road. The passengers were jostled continuously, their bodies colliding with the wooden walls and each other as the coach pitched and rolled. Conversation was difficult, requiring shouted sentences to be heard over the din of transport. As the miles accumulated, the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in bands of bruised purple and orange. The temperature began to drop immediately, the thin desert air failing to retain the heat of the day. Philpott turned up the collar of his coat, shifting his position on the bench. Driving a six-up team was physically exhausting work. It required the upper body strength to hold back thousands of pounds of animal muscle and the dexterity to manipulate individual reins to manage the team's formation. The strain on the shoulders and back was constant. Philpott had driven this route countless times, but the fatigue was cumulative. The vibration of the box seat traveled up his spine, settling as a dull ache in his lower back. They reached the way station at Contention City as the twilight deepened into true dusk. The stop was brief, a calculated pause to water the animals and check the rig. The hostlers moved quickly, their lanterns casting swinging shadows against the flanks of the horses. Steam rose from the animals in the cooling air. Philpott climbed down from the box, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He walked around the team, checking the harness for rubs or loose buckles. He ran a hand down the leg of the near leader, feeling for heat or swelling. The horses were the engine of the enterprise. A thrown shoe or a strained tendon here would leave them stranded in the dark. Bob Paul remained on the box for a moment, scanning the perimeter of the station. Contention was a rough settlement, a place where the mill workers and drifters congregated. It was safer than the open road, but still held the potential for trouble. He watched the shadows between the buildings, looking for anyone paying too much attention to the heavy coach. Seeing nothing but the usual activity of the evening, he climbed down to stretch his legs. The ground felt solid and unmoving after the constant motion of the thoroughbraces. He exchanged a few words with the station agent, confirming the road ahead was reported clear. Reports were often hours old and unreliable, but they were the only intelligence available. When the order came to mount up, a change occurred in the routine. The exact reasoning was never recorded in a logbook. But the physical reality of the shift was absolute. Bud Philpott, feeling the cramp in his hands, or perhaps just the fatigue of the run, did not climb back into the driver's seat. Instead, Bob Paul moved to the right side of the box. The shotgun messenger, a man who had served as a sheriff and knew the handling of a team as well as he knew the handling of a firearm, took the ribbons. Philpott climbed up to the left side, taking the seat usually reserved for the guard. He did not take the shotgun. The weapon remained with Paul, likely resting against the seat or between his knees, ready for the man who was now responsible for both the driving and the defense of the stage. This swap placed Bob Paul in the driver's position, the spot dictated by custom and mechanics to be on the right. The brake lever was on the right, accessible only to the person in that seat. By taking the reins, Paul assumed control of the vehicle's momentum. Philpott, now a passenger on the box, sat exposed on the left, his hands empty of the leather straps that had occupied them for the first leg of the journey. The switch was a casual decision, a professional courtesy between two men who spent their lives on the road. They did not know that this simple rearrangement of bodies would alter the geometry of the coming violence. It shifted the target profile presented to anyone watching from the roadside. Paul cracked the whip, and the fresh team surged forward, pulling the coach away from the lights of Contention and back into the darkness of the San Pedro Valley. The night was now fully established. The moon had risen, providing a pale illumination that turned the landscape into a grayscale photograph. The road was a ribbon of lighter gray against the black brush. Paul drove with a different style than Philpott, perhaps heavier on the brake or sharper in the turns. But the horses adjusted, their ears flicking back to listen to the new voice commanding them. The coach picked up speed, the wheels singing on the hardpack. The air grew significantly colder as they moved into the lower ground near the river. The dampness from the watercourse seeped into the air, adding a biting chill to the wind generated by their speed. Philpott buttoned his coat to the chin, hunching his shoulders against the draft. He watched the ears of the leaders, his eyes performing the same scan he would have done if he were driving. It was impossible for him to disengage completely from the task. He called out hazards, a deep rut on the left, a large rock on the right, acting as a second set of eyes for Paul. The camaraderie on the box was born of shared risk. They were two men alone on top of a rolling target, separated from the passengers below by the roof and from the rest of the world by the miles of empty desert. Below them, the passengers had settled into an uneasy doze. The rhythm of the stage was hypnotic, a repetitive lurching that eventually forced the body into a semi-conscious state. Peter Rohrig sat near the window, the leather curtain, flapping slightly in the wind. He could see nothing but the passing shapes of the mesquite and the occasional spark from the iron tires striking flint. The interior was pitch black, devoid of lanterns to save oil and to prevent the passengers from becoming illuminated targets. They sat in the dark, trusting the men above to deliver them to Benson. The heavy breathing of a fellow traveler and the creak of the wood were the only sounds filling the small cabin. Paul navigated the team through a series of shallow washes, the brake lever groaning as he checked the speed on the descents. The thorough braces stretched and rebounded, swinging the coach body like a pendulum. The Bullion weighed heavily on the suspension, creating a delay in the vehicle's recovery from each dip. Paul had to fight the wheelers to keep the coach traveling in a straight line as the weight tried to slew the rear end around in the soft sand. His arms burned with the effort, the muscles corded under his heavy coat. Driving a Bullion stage was a physical combat with momentum. They passed the milestone that marked the approach to Drew's station. The station was still miles ahead, but the terrain began to change, funneling them toward the specific geography of the ambush site. The valley floor narrowed, the hills pressing in closer to the road. The vegetation became denser, the shadows stretching across the path. Paul kept the horses at a steady trot, maintaining a pace that covered ground without exhausting the animals. He knew the schedule. They were on time, perhaps a few minutes ahead. The efficiency of the run was a point of pride. Philpott lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating his face for a brief second before he cupped it in his hands. The smoke whipped away instantly in the slipstream. He inhaled deeply, the tobacco offering a small comfort against the cold. He looked over at Paul, seeing the profile of the big man against the stars. Paul was focused, his eyes locked on the road, his jaw set. The shotgun was within easy reach, but his hands were full of leather. If trouble started, Paul would have to make a choice. Drop the reins to fight or drive through the danger while Philpott sat unarmed in the prime firing position. The ambiguity of their arrangement was a vulnerability they did not discuss. The sound of the stage was the only disruption in the stillness of the valley. The noise announced their position to anything with ears for miles. To a predator, the stage was a noisy, lumbering beast, blind and deaf to its surroundings due to its own commotion. The drivers could not hear the click of a rifle hammer or the shuffle of a boot in the sand over the roar of the wheels. They were encased in a bubble of sound that masked the world outside. This acoustic isolation was the greatest danger of the night run. They relied entirely on sight, and in the moonlight, sight was treacherous. Paul guided the team around a sharp bend, the leaders stepping high over a patch of rough ground. The coach leaned precariously, the center of gravity shifting. The passengers inside gasped as they slid across the seats, bracing themselves against the walls. Paul corrected the lean with a deft touch of the reins and a stomp on the brake, bringing the vehicle back to level. It was a display of expert driving, the kind that went unnoticed because it prevented disaster. Philpott nodded his approval in the dark. He knew the difficulty of that corner. The road straightened out, running parallel to a dry creek bed. The white sand of the creek glowed in the moonlight, a ghostly river of stone. The stage picked up speed again, the horses sensing the open stretch. They moved into a canter, the rhythm changing from a 2-beat trot to a 3-beat roll. The wind noise increased, rushing past their ears. The tassels on the harness bridles danced in the airflow. It was a moment of pure kinetic energy, the machine and the animals working in perfect synchronization. Approaching the wash near Drew's station, the grade began to change. The road dipped slightly, preparing for the steep descent into the crossing. Paul tightened his grip on the reins, preparing to check the speed. He could see the dark line that marked the cut in the earth. It was just another wash, one of dozens they had crossed since leaving Tombstone. There was no sign that this one was different. No signal fire, no barricade, no warning shout. It was just a shadow across the road, a place where the earth fell away. Philpott leaned forward, peering into the gloom. He was looking for the shine of water or the blockage of debris. Flash floods could alter these washes in minutes, leaving behind logs or boulders that could wreck a coach. He saw nothing but the smooth sand of the bottom. He settled back, relaxing his posture. They would be at the station in less than 10 minutes. A warm fire and a cup of coffee waited for them. The anticipation of the rest stop occupied his mind, pushing away the alertness that had defined the earlier part of the ride. Paul engaged the brake, the iron shoe biting into the wheel rim. The screech was loud, echoing off the canyon walls. The horses dropped back to a trot, then a walk as they reached the lip of the wash. The coach tipped forward, the weight shifting onto the front axle. They began the slide down into the depression. The view of the horizon was cut off by the rising banks on either side. They were descending into a bowl, a secluded pocket of the desert. The air in the wash was still and stagnant, colder than the air above. It smelled of damp sand and sage. The darkness was absolute at the bottom, the moon blocked by the high walls of the cut. The coach leveled out as it hit the sand, the wheels sinking in. The horses dug, their hooves throwing up clods of damp earth. The speed washed away, leaving them crawling through the heavy terrain. This was the point of maximum vulnerability. They were moving at a walking pace, surrounded by cover, with their escape route requiring a steep climb up the opposite bank. The isolation was total. If anything happened here, they were on their own. The town of Tombstone was a memory. Benson was a distant hope. They were 2 men on a box in a hole in the ground, carrying a fortune that belonged to someone else. Bob Paul felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a primitive instinct that something was wrong with the picture. The shadows on the bank seemed too solid, the silence too heavy. He shifted his gaze from the horses to the brush on the left. He saw nothing but the black shapes of the creosote. He looked to the right. The same emptiness. He told himself it was just the nerves of the job, the burden of the silver. He urged the horses forward, wanting to get out of the depression and back onto the high ground. Bud Philpott sat quietly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He was a passenger in his own workplace, trusting his partner to handle the task. He did not know that the crosshairs of a Winchester rifle were already tracking the space where a driver should be sitting. He did not know that the swap had placed him directly in the line of fire intended for the man holding the reins. The coach groaned as it began the ascent, the horses straining. The journey was about to be interrupted by the physics of ballistic impact. The ride from Tombstone was over. The fight for survival was seconds away. The command arrived from the darkness like a physical blow, a harsh, guttural shout that shattered the rhythmic trance of the travel. Hold! The word was not a request. It was an absolute order, delivered with the confidence of men who believed they held the monopoly on violence. It originated from the left bank of the Wash, projecting downward toward the coach that was currently struggling through the deep sand of the creek bottom. The acoustic signature of the voice pinpointed the location of the threat instantly. Someone was standing in the brush, elevated above the road less than 15 yards away. The single syllable hung in the freezing air, stripping away the illusion of a routine run and replacing it with the binary reality of an ambush. For a standard driver, this command triggers a specific psychological sequence: shock, fear, and then compliance. The logic of the road dictated that when a rifle is leveled at you from the dark, the cargo is not worth dying for. The brake is applied, the hands are raised, and the strongbox is kicked down. The highwayman, counting on this sequence, had calculated the probabilities based on the behavior of average men. They assumed the figure holding the reins would value his life over the company's silver. They assumed the suddenness of the challenge would induce paralysis. It was a sound tactical assumption that had worked on countless roads across the territory. But Bob Paul was not a standard driver. And on this night, he was not just a messenger riding shotgun. He was the man controlling the team. The swap at Contention City had placed him in the driver's seat on the right side of the box, with the reins woven through his fingers. When the shout hit his ears, his neural pathways did not route the signal to the center of his brain responsible for surrender. Instead, the stimulus bypassed hesitation entirely and engaged a combat response honed by years of law enforcement. He did not pull back on the ribbons to stop the coach. He did not reach for the brake lever. The command to halt was processed not as an instruction to obey, but as a target designator. The time frame between the shout and the reaction was measurable in heartbeats. In that fraction of a second, Paul realized the tactical disadvantage. The coach was moving slow, dragging through the sand. The team was under strain. The enemy had the high ground and the cover of darkness. Compliance meant stopping the coach in a pre-sighted kill zone where the robbers could dictate every move. Compliance meant surrendering the initiative. Paul rejected the premise of the ambush. He chose to answer the verbal command with kinetic energy. His hands were full of leather. To fight, he had to compromise his control of the vehicle. He did not drop the reins entirely, as that would surrender the horses to panic, but he loosened his grip, shifting the lines to his left hand, while his right hand scrambled for the weapon resting beside him. The shotgun was a heavy, double-barreled instrument of deterrence. It was loaded with buckshot, cartridges filled with large, spherical projectiles designed to spread out and saturate a target area. It was not a precision weapon. It was a tool for clearing a space. The outlaws on the bank were expecting the screech of the brake block against the iron tire. They were expecting the team to check up. Instead, they heard the distinct metallic clack of hammers being thumbed back. Bob Paul shouted back, his voice roaring over the noise of the horses. The exact phrasing would be debated in later retellings, but the sentiment was clear and defiant. He shouted a refusal, a declaration that he yielded to no man in a mask. It was a rejection of their authority, a verbal counter-assault that signaled the robbery was now a battle. Paul swung the barrels of the shotgun toward the source of the voice. He could not see the men clearly. They were shapes, shadows darker than the surrounding brush. He aimed by instinct, leveling the weapon at the elevation where a man's chest would be. The motion was awkward, hampered by his seated position and the reins in his hand, but it was fast. He did not wait to verify a target. The shout was the target. The location of the sound was the aiming point. He squeezed the trigger. The discharge of the shotgun was deafening in the confined space of the wash. The black powder cartridge detonated with a thunderous boom that eclipsed all other sound. A massive tongue of orange flame erupted from the muzzle, illuminating the scene in a strobe light flash of violence. For a split second, the wash was lit up. The terrified eyes of the wheel horses, the sandy banks, the twisted shapes of the mesquite, and the outlines of the men standing on the ridge. The flash destroyed the night vision of everyone involved, searing a purple afterimage into their retinas. The payload of the shell, 9 heavy pellets of hardened metal, tore across the short distance between the coach and the bank. The spread of the shot was still tight at this range. The projectiles slammed into the earth and brush where the outlaws stood. They shredded the leaves of the creosote, snapped branches, and kicked up geysers of dirt. The sheer physics of the blast sent a shockwave through the air that could be felt in the chest. It was a display of raw power, a warning that the victim had teeth. However, the darkness and the motion of the coach conspired against the aim. The shot went slightly high or slightly wide, missing the center of mass of the intended targets. The pellets whistled past the ears of Bill Leonard and his crew, a terrifying sound like angry hornets. The outlaws flinched, the visceral reality of being fired upon shattering their calm control of the situation. They had expected a passive victim. They had received a blast of buckshot. The psychological tables had turned. The predators were now under fire. The recoil of the shotgun kicked hard against Paul's shoulder, jarring his frame. The smoke from the discharge hung thick in the still air, a sulphurous cloud that stung the eyes and throat. He didn't pause. He had a second barrel, a second chance to kill. But the situation had already spiraled into chaos. The horses, terrified by the explosion directly behind their ears, surged forward. The orderly trot disintegrated into a frantic scramble. The leaders lunged into their collars, the swing team scrambled for footing, and the wheelers fought against the weight of the coach. The vehicle jerked violently, throwing the occupants against the seatbacks. On the bank, the hesitation of the outlaws lasted only a second. They were hardened men, accustomed to the sudden eruption of violence. The shock of the resistance was replaced by a cold, lethal rage. The plan for a clean robbery was gone. The only option left was to suppress the threat. 4 Winchester rifles were leveled at the box of the stagecoach. The metallic lever-action mechanisms were worked with rapid precision, cycling rounds into the chambers. The silence of the desert was annihilated by a volley of rifle fire. The sound of the Winchesters was different from the shotgun. A sharp, high-pitched crack repeated in rapid succession. The muzzle flashes sparked from the brush like fireflies, a line of angry light along the top of the bank. The bullets, traveling at supersonic speeds, snapped through the air around the coach. They were not warning shots. They were aimed fire directed at the 2 men sitting exposed on the high seat. The outlaws were firing into the muzzle flash of the shotgun, using Paul's own defense as a beacon for their counterattack. Bob Paul felt the wind of the passing rounds. He heard the sickening thud of projectiles striking the wood of the coach body. Splinters flew into the air. The heavy basswood panels, so strong against the wind, offered no resistance to the rifle slugs. The bullets punched through the side of the vehicle, tearing into the interior space. The air was filled with flying debris and the smell of ozone. Paul struggled to bring the shotgun back on target for a second shot, but the lurching of the coach made aiming impossible. The vehicle was rocking wildly as the horses bolted, dragging it up the sandy incline of the wash. The outlaws adjusted their aim, tracking the moving target. They were firing at a downward angle. This geometry was deadly. It meant the bullets were traversing the space of the driver's box from left to right, high to low. The gunmen were positioned on the left side of the road, the side where the shotgun messenger usually sat. But because of the swap, Bud Philpott was sitting there. The outlaws didn't know the men had changed places. They saw a figure on the left and a figure on the right. They poured fire into the entire area, sweeping the box with a curtain of metal. Luther King, holding the horses in the background, watched the scene unravel. The planned intimidation had dissolved into a frantic firefight. The noise was incredible. The boom of the shotgun, the crack of rifles, the screaming of the horses, and the shouting of men. The quiet ambush had become a war zone in the span of 10 seconds. He struggled to keep the getaway mounts from bolting, his own heart hammering against his ribs. This was the nightmare scenario, the one where the simple job turned into a hanging offense. Bob Paul roared at the team, trying to guide their panic into forward momentum. "Yeah! Get up!" He slapped the reins against the backs of the wheelers, not needing to encourage them, but needing to keep them moving straight. If the team jackknifed in the sand, they were dead men. The coach had to keep moving. It was their only cover, their only escape capsule. The iron tires ground through the sand, the friction fighting against their escape. Every inch of forward progress was a battle against physics and ballistics. The second barrel of the shotgun remained unfired for the moment. Paul realized he needed his hands for the ribbons more than he needed the second shot. If he lost the team, the coach would stop and they would be sitting ducks. He jammed the shotgun between his knees, grabbing the reins with both hands again. The leather was slick with sweat. He hauled on the left rein, trying to keep the coach from running up the side of the cut. The vehicle bounced, the thoroughbraces slamming to the limits of their travel. The outlaws on the bank were running now, moving parallel to the road to keep the stage in their sights. They worked the levers of their rifles, ejecting spent brass casings that glittered as they tumbled through the air. They were shouting to each other, coordinating their fire. "Get the driver, drop the team." The commands were savage, stripped of any pretense of mercy. They were trying to disable the machine that was escaping them. Inside the coach, the world had turned into a terrifying tumbler. The passengers were thrown to the floor as the vehicle surged. They heard the gunfire outside, a terrifying popping sound that seemed to come from all directions. They didn't know who was shooting or why. They only knew that the thin wooden walls were being perforated. The sound of a bullet striking the coach was a distinctive thwack, followed by the hiss of the projectile passing through the cabin. They curled into balls, trying to make themselves small, praying to a god that seemed very far away from this dark wash. Back on the box, the air was alive with death. The space around Paul and Philpott was a swarm of invisible hornets. A bullet struck the metal rail of the seat, ricocheting with a spark and a whine. Another hit the lamps, shattering the glass. The violence was intimate and impersonal at the same time. The men shooting didn't hate Paul or Philpo, they just needed them to stop living so the silver could be taken. It was a transaction being negotiated with gunpowder. Paul glanced at Philpo. The driver was holding on, his body tense, his face a mask of concentration. He was unarmed, a passenger in the storm. He couldn't shoot back. He could only endure. He trusted Paul to get them out just as Paul trusted the horses. The bond between the two men was silent and absolute. They were sharing the same square yard of danger. The stage began to climb the far bank of the wash. The grade was steep. The horses dug in, their flanks heaving. The speed dropped again as gravity asserted itself. This was the second critical moment. As the coach slowed on the climb, it became a stable target once more. The outlaws saw the deceleration. They stopped running, planted their feet, and took careful aim. The distance was opening up, but not enough to matter. 30 yards, 40 yards, easy range for a Winchester. The moonlight caught the silver plating on the harness, making the horses shine. It caught the brass of the railing. It illuminated the men on the box. Paul felt the exposure. He was a silhouette against the sky as they crested the bank. He hunched low, trying to present a smaller target. He yelled at the horses again, a desperate, raw sound. The team responded, their hooves scrambling for purchase on the loose rock of the slope. The shout of "Hold!" seemed like a distant memory now, buried under the avalanche of consequences it had triggered. There was no going back. The threshold had been crossed. The peaceful transit of commerce had been ruptured. The desert night, so vast and indifferent, absorbed the noise of the conflict but offered no shelter. The only way out was through the fire. Bob Paul's decision to fight had saved the silver for the moment, but it had committed them to a running gauntlet. He had gambled that he could suppress the ambush with aggressive action. He had fired into the face of the threat. Now he had to survive the answer. The shotgun shell he had expended was the opening argument in a debate that would leave men dead and history altered. The smell of the burnt powder lingered in his nose, sharp and acrid, the scent of the decision he had just made. As the coach crested the rim of the wash, the full fury of the ambush focused on the two figures on the box. The outlaws, frustrated by the missed opportunity and enraged by the resistance, concentrated their fire. The air around the driver's seat became a vacuum of probability, where the chance of survival dropped with every crack of a rifle. The bullets were no longer warning shots or suppressing fire. They were killing shots, aimed with malice and precision. The running gunfight had begun, and the first casualty was seconds away from being claimed by the physics of a heavy slug moving through the dark. The bullet that ended the life of Bud Philpott was a .44 caliber projectile, a blunt-nosed slug of hardened metal weighing 200 grains. It exited the muzzle of a Winchester rifle on the embankment at a velocity of 1,300 feet per second, spinning rapidly from the rifling of the barrel. The physics of its flight were governed by the cool night air and the descending angle of the shot. It did not travel alone. It was part of a convergence of fire directed at the high box of the stagecoach, but this specific piece of geometry had a terminal destination. The distance was short enough that gravity had little claim on the trajectory. It flew true, a silent, invisible agent of trauma traversing the dark space between the outlaw on the ridge and the man sitting on the left side of the coach. Philpott sat exposed, his body silhouetted against the lighter horizon of the sky. He had no cover. The dashboard of the stage was low, designed to stop mud, not high-velocity ammunition. He was clutching the rail, his body braced against the violent lurching of the vehicle as the horses clawed their way up the sandy incline. He was not driving. His hands were empty of the reins, leaving him with nothing to focus on but the muzzle flashes sparking from the brush. He turned slightly, perhaps reacting to the sound of the first volley or instinctively trying to shield his face. This movement presented his profile to the shooters, opening the vulnerable cavity of his chest to the incoming fire. The projectile struck him with the force of a sledgehammer. It entered his body just below the left shoulder blade, punching through the heavy wool of his coat and the layers of muscle beneath. The impact was audible, a wet, dense thud that could be heard over the ring of the harness. The bullet did not stop. It drove diagonally through his torso, tearing through the intricate machinery of his life. It severed the aorta, the main artery carrying blood from the heart to the rest of the body. The damage was catastrophic and instantaneous. The hydrostatic shock of the impact collapsed the surrounding tissue, creating a massive temporary cavity inside his chest before the tissue snapped back, pulverized and bleeding. Philpott did not cry out. The destruction of his heart and the massive drop in blood pressure silenced him before his brain could register the pain. His nervous system short-circuited. The tension in his muscles vanished, replaced by the limp, dead weight of a corpse. For a fraction of a second, he remained upright, balanced by the momentum of the coach and the position of his feet. Then the physics of the turn and the sway of the thoroughbraces took over. His center of gravity shifted. He slumped forward, his head dropping toward his chest, his body folding at the waist like a hinge. Bob Paul, sitting inches away, felt the impact more than he saw it. A spray of warm fluid struck his cheek, blood atomized by the exit wound or the sheer violence of the hit. He turned his head and saw his friend collapsing. There was no time to reach out, no hand free to grab the falling man. Paul was fighting the leather ribbons, his arms locked in a struggle with the 6 terrified horses. He watched, helpless, as Philpott pitched forward off the seat. The motion was slow at first, then accelerated by gravity. Philpott tumbled over the footboard, his boots catching briefly on the iron rail before slipping free. The body fell between the wheelers, the 2 massive horses hitched closest to the coach. This was a nightmare scenario for any driver. A foreign object falling into the traces of a moving team creates immediate, explosive panic. Philpott hit the tongue of the coach, the heavy wooden pole that ran between the horses, then bounced onto the doubletrees. The wheelers, sensing the weight and the smell of fresh blood, reacted with primal terror. They kicked out, their iron-shod hooves striking the wood and the limp form of the driver. The rhythmic gallop shattered into a chaotic bucking and surging. Philpott's body did not stay on the tongue. It slid off to the side, falling beneath the hooves of the near wheeler and the grinding iron of the front wheel. The coach, moving at a speed of 10 miles per hour, ran over the fallen man. The heavy wheel, supporting thousands of pounds of bullion and timber, crushed what remained of his structure. The vehicle gave a sickening jolt as it rolled over the obstacle, lifting the left side momentarily before slamming back down. The vibration traveled up through the frame, a grim tactile confirmation to the passengers inside that something significant had been struck. The loss of the driver was not just a human tragedy, it was a mechanical failure for the team. Although Paul held the reins, the disruption caused by the fall broke the psychological link between the human and the animals. The horses were now operating on instinct. The smell of the blood, sharp and metallic, drove them into a frenzy. They lunged against the collars, snapping the traces taut with enough force to threaten the hardware. The coach surged forward erratically, jerking left and right as the wheelers fought to get away from the thing that had fallen among them. On the bank, the outlaws saw the figure drop. A shout went up, a cry of success. They believed they had killed the man controlling the vehicle. In the confusion of the darkness and the muzzle flashes, they assumed the stage would now careen out of control and crash. They intensified their fire, aiming for the remaining figure on the box to ensure a total stop. The air around Paul buzzed with fresh lead. Bullets struck the seat where Philpott had been sitting a second before, splintering the wood and tearing the leather cushion. Bob Paul was now alone in the storm. The space beside him was empty, marked only by a smear of blood on the seat rail. The reality of his position was stark. He was the sole target on the roof, managing a runaway team, with the body of his partner lying somewhere in the dust behind them. He did not look back. There was no point. He knew Philpott was gone. The focus of his existence narrowed to the leather straps in his hands. He had to keep the horses on the road. If they swerved into the brush or the ditch, the coach would flip and they would all be slaughtered in the wreck. The terrain contributed to the danger. They were still climbing out of the wash, the ground uneven and soft. The coach fishtailed, the rear wheels sliding in the sand. Paul leaned his weight against the turn, using his body as a counterbalance. He roared at the horses, his voice cracking with the strain. He needed them to run, but he needed them to run straight. The panic of the wheelers was transmitting to the swing team and the leaders. The formation was disintegrating. The horses were crowding each other, their shoulders bumping, risking a tangle of legs that would bring the whole rig down. Blood from the initial wound had splattered onto the reins in Paul's hands. The leather became slippery, difficult to grip. He wrapped the lines around his wrists, locking them in place. He could feel the pulse of the team through the straps, a frantic, irregular rhythm. The vibration of the coach was violent, shaking his bones. He was riding a whirlwind, trying to steer a tornado with strips of cowhide. The shotgun lay at his feet, useless for the moment. To pick it up would mean dropping the reins, and dropping the reins meant death. The outlaws ran along the rim of the wash, trying to keep pace. They saw the coach picking up speed despite the chaos. The horses, driven by fear, were finding a new gear. They clawed their way to the top of the bank and hit the harder ground of the road. The iron tires bit into the surface, gaining traction. The acceleration pushed Paul back into his seat. The gap between the shooters and the target began to open. The ambition of the ambush was slipping away, replaced by the desperation of a chase. Below in the cabin, the passengers felt the sickening bump. They heard the change in the rhythm of the hooves. They knew something terrible had happened on the box. The shouting outside was muffled, but the panic was palpable. Peter Rohrig and the others gripped the window frames, their knuckles white. They were trapped in a wooden box that was being perforated by bullets and dragged by hysterical animals. They could feel the coach slewing sideways, the wheels leaving the ground for terrifying intervals. Philpott's body lay in the dirt of the road, a dark heap in the moonlight. The dust settled around him, coating the wool of his jacket. The violence of his death had been absolute. One moment a man with a job and a future, the next a piece of debris left in the wake of a crime. The silence of the desert began to reclaim the spot where he fell, even as the noise of the fight moved further down the road. The blood soaked into the thirsty earth, a dark stain that would remain long after the sun rose. The shooters did not stop to check the body. They were focused on the escaping prize. They fired at the back of the coach, at the retreating shape of the messenger. The bullets punched through the rear boot, smashing into the luggage. They were firing blind now, sending rounds downrange in frustration. The sounds of the shots grew fainter as the distance increased, but the danger remained. A lucky shot could still hit a horse or the driver. Paul kept his eyes forward. The tears in his eyes were from the wind and the dust, not from grief. Grief was a luxury for the survivors, and he was not yet a survivor. He was still a combatant. He processed the death of Philpo as a tactical change. He was now fighting for two men. The rage began to build in his chest, a cold, hard knot. They had killed a good man, a man who was just doing a job. The injustice of it fueled his grip on the reins. He would not let them take the coach. He would drive the wheels off before he surrendered. The road ahead was a blur of shadows. Paul trusted the leaders to find the path. He gave them their head, loosening the tension on the lines just enough to let them run full out. The horses sensed the freedom. They stretched their necks, their strides lengthening. The coach began to fly, bouncing over ruts that would normally require a brake. The suspension groaned under the abuse. The thoroughbraces slapped against the bottom of the carriage. The physical exertion of holding the team was immense. Paul's shoulders screamed with the effort. The muscles in his forearms were rock hard. He braced his boots against the dashboard, using his legs to anchor himself. He was the linchpin holding the entire assembly together. If he failed, the coach became a missile. If he held, it remained a vehicle. The memory of the impact would stay with him forever. The sound, the spray of blood, the way Philpot's body had just erased itself from the seat, and it was a brutal lesson in the fragility of life. 1 second of bad geometry, one piece of metal occupying the same space as a heart, and a man was gone. There were no final words, no dramatic speeches. Just the physics of ballistics and gravity. As the stage thundered away from the scene of the murder, the reality of the situation settled in. They were running a gauntlet. The outlaws were behind them, but the desert was all around them. The horses were blown, their reserves tapped by the panic. The coach was damaged, and there was a dead man on the road behind them. The night had only just begun, and the toll was already paid in blood. Paul risked a quick glance back, seeing only the dust cloud and the distant sparks of muzzle flashes. They were falling behind. The immediate threat of the ambush was fading, but the consequences were riding with him. He turned back to the front, his jaw set. He had to get the Bullion to Benson, he had to get the passengers to safety, and he had to tell the world what had happened in the dark wash at Drew's station. The drop of the driver was the beginning of the retribution, not the end of the fight. The stability of the Concorde coach vanished the moment the horses bolted. In normal operation, the leather thoroughbraces acted as a cradle, swaying gently to absorb the shocks of the road. Now, under the erratic, terrified power of 6 panic-stricken animals, the suspension system turned into a catapult. The heavy body of the vehicle was no longer riding the road, it was fighting against it. The leather straps, thick as a man's thigh and cured to a rigid toughness, stretched and snapped back with violent force. The coach pitched forward and back, then rolled side to side, the motion amplified by the high center of gravity created by the $26,000 of bullion stacked on the floor. It was like riding a small boat in a hurricane, but the waves were solid rock and hard-packed earth. Bob Paul sat at the fulcrum of this chaos. His position on the right side of the box, usually the seat of authority for the driver, had become a precarious perch. He had no seatbelt, no restraint system to keep him anchored. He relied entirely on the friction of his trousers against the leather cushion and the strength of his legs braced against the dashboard. Every lurch of the coach threatened to launch him into the void. When the left wheels struck a rock, the vehicle heeled over sharply to the right, throwing his weight against the iron railing. When the right wheels dipped into a rut, he was pulled toward the center, sliding across the blood-slicked seat where his partner had been sitting seconds before. The running gunfight was not a clean exchange of fire. It was a disjointed, deafening brawl conducted at high velocity. The outlaws, realizing their prey was escaping, abandoned their positions in the wash and scrambled onto the road. They fired from the shoulder, working the levers of their Winchesters with frantic speed. The muzzle flashes appeared as stroboscopic bursts in the rearview darkness, jagged stars of light that preceded the arrival of the projectiles. The bullets did not hum, they cracked. They slapped into the back of the coach, splintering the wood of the rear boot and punching through the leather luggage covers. Paul could not simply drive away. He had to survive the gauntlet. The team was running flat out, their bellies low to the ground, their hooves striking sparks from the flinty stones. The speed was terrifying, 15, perhaps 20 miles per hour, over a surface meant for a walking pace. The wind roared in Paul's ears, tearing at his hat and stinging his eyes with grit. He held the ribbons in his left hand, the leather straps biting deep into his palm. His arm muscles were locked in a titanic contraction, fighting the combined pull of 6,000 pounds of horseflesh. The animals were not running in a coordinated rhythm anymore. The fear had broken their cadence. The leaders were pulling away from the swings and the wheelers were crowding the tongue, creating a jerking, surging motion that traveled up the reins and shook Paul's entire skeleton. With his right hand, Paul groped for the shotgun. He had jammed it between his knees during the initial scramble, but the violent motion of the coach threatened to dislodge it. He needed to return fire. Passive escape was not enough. He had to suppress the pursuit. He managed to grip the stock of the weapon, bringing it up one-handed. It was an awkward, desperate maneuver. Aiming was impossible. The coach was bouncing so violently that the horizon line jumped 10 degrees with every second. He pointed the barrels back over his left shoulder, toward the flashes in the dark, and pulled the trigger on the second barrel. The recoil of the 12-gauge buckshot load, fired one-handed without a proper stock weld, was punishing. The gun kicked back, twisting in his grip and slamming the trigger guard against his knuckles. The muzzle flash illuminated the roof of the coach and the retreating road for a microsecond. He didn't know if the pellets found a target. The spread would have been wide, a cloud of 9 heavy spheres flying back into the teeth of the ambush. The act of firing was more psychological than tactical. It told the men behind him that the stage was still fighting, that the box was not empty. The response from the road was immediate. The outlaws concentrated their fire on the source of the flash. A fresh volley of rifle rounds swarmed around the coach. One bullet struck the iron tire of the rear wheel, ricocheting with a high-pitched scream that cut through the thunder of the hooves. Another projectile smashed into the wooden frame of the box seat, sending a shower of sharp splinters into Paul's face. He ducked his head, tucking his chin into his coat collar, making himself as small a target as possible. The air around him felt solid with the passage of death. The chase moved out of the wash and onto the flat ground of the valley floor. Here the road straightened, but the surface was corrugated with washboard ruts. The vibration became a continuous bone-rattling shudder. The thoroughbraces could not cycle fast enough to absorb the rapid-fire impacts. The coach body hammered against the axle trees. Inside the wheel hubs, the iron boxing ground against the axles, the friction generating intense heat despite the grease. The noise was an industrial cacophony, wood groaning, iron clashing, leather creaking, and the heavy breathing of the team. Paul risked a look at the horses. They were foaming, white lather streaking their necks and flanks. The whites of their eyes were visible in the moonlight, rolling in terror. They were running blind, driven only by the instinct to escape the noise and the smell of blood. The danger now was a stumble. If a leader lost its footing at this speed, the entire team would pile up. The coach would override the fallen animals, flipping end over end. It would be a catastrophic wreck that would leave no survivors. Paul had to modulate their speed without breaking their momentum. He sawed gently on the reins, trying to communicate with the hard mouths of the animals, trying to bring them back from the edge of hysteria to a controlled gallop. The outlaws were falling behind, their foot speed no match for the sprint of the horses, but they had likely mounted their own horses by now or were firing from a stationary stance for better accuracy. The range was opening 50 yards, then 70. At this distance, the Winchester rifle was still deadly accurate, but the darkness protected the stage. The target was moving away, becoming a smaller and smaller block of shadow. The shooters had to calculate the drop of the bullet and the movement of the coach. Their shots began to go wide, kicking up dust plumes on either side of the road or singing harmlessly overhead. But the danger inside the coach's mechanics was increasing. The heavy silver bullion acted as a pendulum weight. With every sway of the thoroughbraces, the momentum of the silver tried to twist the frame of the carriage. The wood screamed under the torsion. Joints that had held for years were being tested to their breaking point. If a thoroughbrace snapped, the body of the coach would drop onto the axle, snapping the spine of the vehicle and sending it cartwheeling into the desert. Paul could feel the strain in the seat of his pants. He knew the limits of the Abbott Downing engineering were being pushed into the red zone. He felt a wetness on his hand and realized his knuckles were bleeding, skinned raw by the recoil or the rough leather of the reins. He ignored the pain. His focus was absolute. He watched the road ahead, scanning for the washout or the boulder that would end their run. The moonlight cast deceptive shadows, making ruts look like canyons and bushes look like bears. He had to trust his memory of the road as much as his eyes. He guided the team to the center of the track, keeping them away from the soft shoulders where the sand was deep. The pursuit began to fade. The volume of fire decreased, the shots becoming sporadic. The outlaws had realized the geometry of the situation. The bullion was gone. They had failed to stop the vehicle in the kill zone, and now they were wasting ammunition on a ghost. The silence that followed the cessation of gunfire was not quiet. It was filled with the roaring wind and the pounding hooves, but the lethal crack of the rifles was gone. Paul did not slow down. He couldn't. The horses were seized by a momentum that couldn't be checked simply by pulling back. They had to run the fear out of their systems. He let them gallop, using the miles to put a safe distance between the silver and the ambushers. He managed the ribbons with a grim determination, his mind racing through the inventory of the damage. He was alive. The coach was moving. Philpott was dead. The passengers. He didn't know about the passengers. He hadn't heard a sound from inside the cabin since the shooting started. The noise of the run drowned out everything else. The environment passed in a blur of gray and black. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels witnessing the flight, their arms raised in silent testimony. The mountains in the distance were immovable black shapes, indifferent to the human struggle playing out at their feet. The cold night air rushed into Paul's lungs, burning his throat. He gasped for breath, the adrenaline demand of his body outstripping his oxygen intake. He was sweating despite the freezing temperature, a cold, clammy perspiration that soaked his shirt. He holstered the shotgun, or rather wedged it back between the seat and the rail. He needed both hands now. The road was approaching a series of curves near the river. He wrapped the reins around his hands again, seeking a fresh grip on dry leather. He leaned back, putting his entire body weight against the pull. Easy, easy now. His voice was a hoarse croak, lost in the wind. He wasn't commanding them, he was pleading with them. He needed the wheelers to engage, to sit back in the breeching and act as brakes. The thoroughbraces continued their violent dance. The coach lurched over a rise, catching air for a terrifying second before slamming down. The impact jarred Paul's spine, his teeth clacking together. He tasted the copper tang of blood in his mouth. He must have bitten his tongue. The physical abuse of the ride was cumulative. Every muscle fiber was vibrating with tension. He was a biological component of a runaway machine, the only thinking part in a system governed by panic and physics. As the adrenaline began to plateau, the reality of his solitude struck him. He was alone on the box. The empty space to his left was a gaping wound in the world. He kept expecting Philpott to say something, to warn him about a rock or a dip. The silence from that side of the seat was louder than the gunshots had been. It was a void that sucked at his attention. He forced himself not to look at the bloodstains. He had to drive. He had to be the driver now. The horses began to tire. The frantic sprint settled into a laboring gallop. Their breathing became audible, heavy rasps that heaving their sides. The foam flew from their mouths, landing on the traces in the dashboard. Paul felt the change in the tension on the lines. They were no longer pulling with the manic strength of terror. They were pulling with the desperate strength of exhaustion. This was the window of opportunity. He began to apply steady rhythmic pressure on the bits, signaling them to slow. He did not use the brake yet. The brake blocks would be useless against the momentum of the full gallop. They would just burn up or lock the wheels and cause a skid. He used the friction of the ground and the fatigue of the animals. He guided them through the turns with gentle arcs, avoiding sharp inputs that could unbalance the rig. The coach responded, the swaying becoming slightly less violent, the impacts less jarring. The dust cloud behind them was immense, a long trail of suspended earth marking their passage. If the outlaws were still watching, that dust was the sign of their failure. The Bullion was moving away at 20 feet per second. The robbery had been botched. The brute force of the ambush had been met with the brute force of survival. The stagecoach, a relic of wood and leather, had survived the assault of modern repeating rifles. Paul's hands were cramping, his fingers clawed into the shape of the reins. He couldn't open them fully. The leather had impressed its texture into his skin. He was fused to the vehicle. He checked the road ahead, his eyes burning. He needed to get to Benson. He needed a telegraph office. He needed a posse. The thoughts formed a checklist in his mind, a way to organize the chaos. The running gunfight had lasted perhaps 3 minutes, perhaps 5. It felt like hours. Time had distorted, stretching during the shooting and compressing during the driving. The distance they had covered was significant. They were miles from Drew's station now. The immediate threat of the rifles was gone. replaced by the threat of the aftermath. The coach was full of bullet holes. The structure was compromised. And there was a silence from the cabin below that was beginning to terrify him more than the gunfire. He kept the team moving, maintaining a hard trot now. The thorough braces settled into a rhythm that was manageable, a steady rocking rather than a violent pitching. The world stopped spinning and returned to a linear path. The road to Benson lay ahead, a dark ribbon leading to safety, but the cargo they carried was no longer just silver. They were carrying the weight of the event, the forensic evidence of a crime that would shake the territory. Bob Paul adjusted his hat, pulling it down tight. He checked the shotgun one last time, ensuring the remaining shells hadn't shaken loose from his pocket. He was ready if they came back, but deep down he knew the fight was over. The race was won, but the cost was yet to be tallied. He drove on into the night, a solitary figure on a battered stagecoach, leaving a trail of blood and dust in the Arizona desert. The interior of the Kinnear & Company stagecoach was a sensory deprivation chamber defined by darkness and vibration. While the men on the box sat exposed to the open sky and the biting wind, the passengers were sealed within a wooden capsule roughly 5 feet wide and 5 feet high. The space was utilitarian, designed to maximize revenue rather than comfort. 3 bench seats ran across the width of the carriage, 1 forward-facing at the rear, 1 rear-facing at the front, and a middle bench where travelers sat with no backrest, swaying in time with the vehicle's motion. On this specific run, the air inside was stagnant, a recycled mixture of dust, tobacco residue, and the body heat of the occupants. The leather curtains were rolled down and fastened tight to block the chill of the desert night, effectively blinding everyone inside to the world passing by outside. Peter Rohrig rode the rear dicky seat, the exposed perch bolted to the back of the coach above the boot. It was the position many travelers preferred. It offered a backrest and a forward view of the road, but it also offered nothing else. He was a man of ordinary stature, traveling for reasons that were entirely personal, and now utterly irrelevant to the violence unfolding around him. Behind him was only the night and a thin iron rail. In front of him was the black ribbon of the Benson Road and the swaying box where the other passengers tried to sleep. The rhythm of the ride and the creak of leather had lulled everyone into a semi-comatose state. The ticket they purchased felt like a guarantee of safe passage. They were cargo, passive and oblivious, separated from the $26,000 of silver bullion by only the boards and straps beneath their boots. The ambush did not announce itself to the passengers with a visual cue. There were no muzzle flashes visible through the thick leather curtains. It began as a sonic intrusion. The shout of "Hold!" from the wash penetrated the wooden walls as a muffled, angry bark. It was an anomaly, a disruption of the monotonous grinding of the wheels. Heads snapped up in the gloom, eyes widened, straining to see through the blackness. Before anyone could voice a question or articulate a concern, the chassis of the coach shuddered violently. This was the moment Bob Paul discharged his shotgun on the box above. The boom was deafening from inside, a percussive slam that vibrated through the roof structure. It sounded as if the coach itself had exploded. Immediately following the blast, the physics of the ride shifted from a controlled trot to a violent, jerking surge. Inside the cabin, bodies slammed against wood, and on the rear dicky seat, Rohrig was nearly peeled off the back of the coach. The acceleration was not smooth. It was a series of kinetic yanks as the team fought against the traces. He instinctively grabbed the iron rail and the edge of the seat, his fingers digging into cold metal and leather. The coach dipped sharply as it hit the bottom of the wash, the suspension bottoming out with a groan of stressed leather and wood. The sensation was similar to falling, a sudden drop in the pit of the stomach followed by a crushing upward force as the springs rebounded. Then came the sound that no traveler ever wanted to hear, the sharp, distinct cracking of high-velocity rifle fire impacting the vehicle. The Outlaws were pouring fire into the coach, and the thin basswood panels offered no more ballistic protection than a sheet of paper. The bullets did not just puncture the wood, they shattered it. The sound was a terrifying, rapid-fire thwack, 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 like a hammer striking a melon. Splinters of dry wood, razor-sharp and moving at high speed, erupted from the walls, spraying the interior with shrapnel. The sanctuary of the cabin had been breached. Peter Roerig sat in the direct line of fire. The Outlaws, positioned behind and to the side of the fleeing vehicle, were firing at the rear of the coach to stop the messenger. The bullets had to chew through the rear boot, the luggage compartment that formed the back of the stage, before they could reach the perch where he rode. Layers of leather, canvas, and packed clothing did nothing to stop the heavy slugs. It merely destabilized them. A projectile struck the rear panel, punched through a leather valise filled with laundry, tumbled as it lost a fraction of its velocity, and tore through the frame behind the dicky seat. The slug that found Peter Roerig hit with the force of a falling anvil. It carried splinters and grit with it, tearing cloth and flesh in a single, indifferent instant. There was no theatrical cry, no dramatic final words. The shock to his system was total. The air was driven from his lungs in a sudden wet gasp, swallowed by the wind and the roar of the wheels. He slumped sideways against the iron rail, his equilibrium destroyed by massive trauma, his body trying to keep riding even as it began to fail. Panic erupted inside the confined space. The other passengers scrambled to get low, diving for the floorboards, trying to curl into the smallest possible shapes. They were trapped in a dark box that was being perforated by invisible hornets. A bullet hissed through the cabin at ear level, exiting through the front wall and burying itself in the driver's footboard. Another struck the iron tire of the wheel just outside the thin wall, the ring of the impact loud enough to hurt the ears. The smell of gun smoke began to seep into the interior, sharp and acrid, mixing with the smell of old dust and fresh fear. Roerig did not fall away immediately. He couldn't. His body was pinned to the rear perch by the iron rail, the jolting motion and the slackening of his own control. He slid slowly to the right, his head lolling against the woodwork, the wind clawing at his hat. The rough motion of the runaway stage battered his wounded form. Every rut in the road, every sway of the thoroughbraces sent a fresh wave of shock through his damaged anatomy. The blood began to soak his coat, warm and sticky, pooling on the leather of the dicky seat and dripping down onto the boot and the dust below. Inside the cabin, someone heard the dull, wrong sound from the back, a heavy thump that did not belong to any wheel or spring. A hand reached toward the rear wall in the darkness, feeling for a latch, a voice, anything human, and found only splintered wood and vibrating panels. The realization set in among the group in fragments, shouted and half-formed. The man riding the rear perch was hit. The abstract terror of the gunfire had become a concrete reality. Death was not sitting quietly on a bench among them, it was clinging to the back of the coach while the world outside rushed by at 20 miles per hour. As the coach climbed out of the wash and hit the straight road, the swaying became rhythmic but violent. The rifle fire outside began to fade, the cracks becoming more distant, but the terror inside did not diminish. They were moving too fast. The coach felt top-heavy, threatening to tip over with every correction Bob Paul made on the box above. The passengers braced their feet against the walls, against the seats, against each other, forming a human web of tension to keep from being tossed around like dice in a cup. Roerig was still alive, but his connection to the world was severing. The pain was not a clean sensation. It was a spreading fire that tried to consume every thought. Cold air rushed across his face as the stage fled, and each breath came harder than the last, mixing with the taste of dust and blood. The road shook him like a loose bolt in a tin can. He tried to hold himself upright, but his arms no longer listened. The night kept taking pieces of him mile by mile. The other passengers could do nothing. There was no light to examine the wound, no medical supplies to treat it, and no way to stop the coach to get help. To stop meant to be overtaken by the men, with the rifles. They had to endure the ride. They had to sit in the dark with the dying man and pray that the driver knew what he was doing. They did not know that Bud Philpott was already dead on the road behind them. They assumed the frantic pace was a calculated escape, not a desperate flight by a lone survivor on the box. The vibration of the floorboards transmitted the violence of the road directly into their bodies. Their teeth rattled. Their bones ached from the constant tension of bracing. Dust billowed up from the floor, choking them, making them cough. The coughing was the only sound inside the cabin other than the mechanical noise. It was a dry, hacking chorus that punctuated the silence of the man in the corner. A sudden lurch to the left sent the passengers sliding across the floor, and it slammed Rorig's limp weight against the iron rail on the rear perch. His head snapped and settled again. The coach was a machine of motion, and he was now just another part being battered by it. The jolts that had once been merely uncomfortable became an executioner's rhythm, shaking what little strength remained out of him. The ride dragged on. Minutes stretched into eternities. The adrenaline that had spiked at the sound of the first shot began to curdle into a cold dread. They were miles from nowhere, hurtling through the night in a damaged vehicle. Every time the coach hit a rock, they flinched, expecting the wheels to shatter or the axle to snap. The structural integrity of the coach was their only hope, and they had heard the wood splintering under fire. They listened to the creaking of the frame, analyzing every groan for the sound of failure. Peter Rorig's breathing changed. The wet rasp slowed, the gaps between breaths widening into cold, terrifying spaces. The wind stole the sound, but his body felt the loss of it, a stuttering failure that no grit of will could reverse. One breath came shallow, the next did not arrive on time. His grip loosened, then disappeared, and his weight settled into stillness. The silence that followed his death was heavy, but it was not the silence of peace. Inside the cabin, the passengers could only guess what the dark rear of the coach now carried. They stopped hearing any movement from behind, and in the absence of sound, the mind filled in the worst. The frantic rhythm of survival continued, but something essential had changed. They were no longer just running from robbery, they were running with a corpse. One passenger, a man with a heavy coat, tried to light a match to see the damage. The flame flared for a second, illuminating the jagged holes punched through the rear wall, the shredded leather of the curtains, and the pale dust cloud hanging in the cabin like smoke before the draft from the window snuffed it out. The brief flash was enough. The image was burned into their minds, the splintered wood, the torn upholstery, and the sense that the coach itself had been shot full of teeth. It confirmed their worst fears. They were not just victims of a robbery, they were witnesses to a capital crime. The coach began to slow slightly as the horses tired, settling into a grueling trot. The violence of the motion decreased, but the psychological torture continued. They were still moving, still in the dark, still trapped. They wondered if the outlaws were pursuing on horseback. They strained their ears, listening for the sound of approaching hooves over the noise of their own passage. Every shadow that flitted past the window looked like a rider. Paranoia filled the vacuum left by the adrenaline. The Bullion, the cause of all this misery, remained silent and secure beneath them. It was indifferent to the tragedy. The silver bars did not bleed. They did not feel pain. They were simply mass continuing their journey to the bank. The human cost of moving that metal was currently lying crumpled on the floor, a debit in the ledger of the territory's history. As the miles accumulated, the cold seeped into the cabin, chilling the sweat on their bodies. They shivered, their teeth chattering. The cold was a physical reminder of their vulnerability. They were soft flesh in a land of hard rocks and harder men. The wooden walls of the coach, which had seemed so solid in Tombstone, now felt like a coffin. They were traveling in a hearse, rushing toward a destination that offered no guarantee of safety, only the certainty of an end to the motion. Bob Paul, driving above, had no way of knowing the condition of his passengers. He could not hear them over the wind. He could not leave the reins to check. He drove with the assumption that they were terrified but alive. He did not know that he was transporting a dead man. The disconnect between the driver and the passengers was total. They were united by the vehicle but separated by the experience. Paul was fighting the road. The passengers were fighting the horror of helplessness. The journey to Benson became a funeral procession at full speed. The passengers sat in a vigil of silence, honoring the dead man with their fear. They watched the patch of sky visible through the window, waiting for the lights of the town, for the sign of civilization that would signal the end of the nightmare. But the desert went on, mile after mile of shadow and silence, broken only by the relentless turning of the wheels. When the lights of Benson finally appeared on the horizon, a collective exhale went through the cabin. It was not a cheer. It was a release of pressure. They were going to make it. The ordeal was ending. But as the coach rattled toward the town, they knew that the door opening would not bring relief. It would bring the light, and the light would reveal the blood. The arrival would not be a celebration. It would be an inquest. Peter Rohrig arrived in Benson not as a traveler, but as evidence. His journey had ended in the dark wash, but his body continued to be carried forward by the momentum of the stage and the desperation of a man who refused to stop. The holes in the coach wall, the blood on the leather, and the dead passenger on the rear dicky seat would become part of the official record, a physical testament to the violence that accompanied the wealth of Tombstone. For the survivors, it was not a story yet. It was a memory being burned into them with every mile. The lights of Benson appeared on the northern horizon not as a beacon of hope, but as a rigid geometric pattern of yellow lanterns suspended in the black void of the San Pedro Valley. For Bob Paul, sitting alone on the box of the battered Kinnear and Company stagecoach, these lights represented the termination point of a physical ordeal that had stretched his endurance to the breaking point. The distance from Drew's station to Benson was measured in miles, but the journey he had just completed was measured in the gradual failure of his own anatomy. His hands, wrapped tightly in the leather reins, had ceased to function as articulate appendages miles ago. The cold night air, combined with the restriction of blood flow caused by his death grip on the straps, had frozen his fingers into permanent claws. The leather was tacky with a substance that had cooled and hardened in the wind. The blood of Bud Philpott, which had sprayed across the driver's side of the coach during the initial volley. The team of 6 horses, once a powerhouse of kinetic energy, was now a ragged collection of stumbling animals. Their flanks were heaving, covered in a thick, frothy lather that turned gray in the moonlight. They had run at a full gallop for a distance that defied the standard operating procedures of the stage line, driven by panic and the relentless urging of the man on the box. Now, sensing the proximity of the stables and water, they dropped their heads, their breathing loud and raspy, pulling the heavy load through the final stretch of deep sand near the river crossing. The sound of their hooves was no longer a sharp, rhythmic clatter, but a dull, uneven thudding against the earth. Paul did not relax his vigilance as the buildings of the town began to take shape. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the gunfight and the subsequent chase had drained away, leaving behind a crater of exhaustion. His shoulders burned with a deep muscular ache, the result of fighting the dead weight of the coach through every rut and wash. He kept his eyes moving, scanning the perimeter of the road, though his vision was blurred by wind, tears, and fatigue. The paranoia of the ambush remained. Every shadow cast by a mesquite bush looked like a rifleman. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a lever-action mechanism cycling around. The coach rolled onto the main street of Benson, the iron tires crunching loudly on the gravel. The arrival of the stage was usually a routine event, marked by the shout of the driver and the bustle of passengers. Tonight, the arrival was a grim, silent affair. There was no horn, no shout, no cracking of the whip. The vehicle simply materialized out of the darkness, a ghost ship drifting into harbor. The appearance of the coach told the story before a word was spoken. The side panels were splintered and perforated, scarred by the passage of heavy slugs. The lamps were smashed, their glass housings gone, leaving dark, empty sockets. The luggage in the rear boot was shredded, the contents spilling out in a chaotic mess of torn fabric. Paul guided the team toward the Wells Fargo station, his movements stiff and mechanical. He pulled back on the reins, the leather ribbons digging into the raw skin of his palms. The wheelers sat back in the breeching, the harness tightening around their rumps to break the momentum. The coach groaned to a halt in front of the station office, the suspension settling with a final, weary creak. Steam rose from the horses in a dense cloud, smelling of wet hair and animal exertion. The silence that followed the stop was heavy, amplified by the absence of the usual driver. The station agent, a man accustomed to the rhythm of the schedule, stepped out onto the porch, a lantern swinging in his hand. He looked up at the box, expecting to see Bud Philpott's familiar face and hear a joke about the road. Instead, he saw Bob Paul sitting alone on the right side, his face a mask of dust and grim purpose. The agent raised the lantern higher, the light falling on the empty seat to the left. The wood was stained dark. The rail was bent. The absence of the driver was a physical hole in the scene. The agent lowered the light, his eyes wide, understanding instantly that the routine had been shattered. Paul tried to open his hands to release the reins, but his fingers refused to obey. He had to pry them loose one by one, peeling the leather away from his skin. The pain was sharp, a stinging reminder of the tension he had held for the last hour. He threw the ribbons down to the hostlers who had emerged from the stable, their faces registering the shock of the damaged rig. "Easy with them," Paul croaked, his voice a dry husk. "They're blown. Walk them cool." He climbed down from the box, his legs numb. When his boots hit the boardwalk, he stumbled, catching himself on the wheel. The ground felt unstable, rocking beneath him as if he were still riding the thoroughbraces. The door to the passenger compartment remained closed. There was no movement from inside. The silence from the cabin was unnerving. The station agent stepped forward, reaching for the handle. He hesitated for a second, sensing the wrongness of the situation, then turned the latch and swung the heavy wooden door open. The light from his lantern flooded the interior, revealing the tableau of the aftermath. The passengers, who were still alive, sat frozen, their eyes adjusting to the sudden illumination. They were huddled against the walls, their clothes covered in dust and splinters. Behind the coach, on the rear dicky seat above the boot, lay the body of Peter Ruhrig. The unnatural angle of his limbs and the stillness of his form left no room for diagnosis. The blood had soaked the leather and run down the boards, darkening the dust on the boot below. The passengers nearest the door scrambled to get out, pushing past the agent. Desperate to escape the confinement of the death ride, they stumbled onto the porch, gasping for fresh air, their legs shaking uncontrollably. They began to speak all at once, a chaotic babble of terror and relief, pointing at the coach, at the holes in the walls, at the dark road behind them. Paul walked past the open door, pushing through the gathering crowd, and went straight to the back of the coach. He looked up at the rear perch, confirming what he had suspected since the shooting stopped. Ruhrig was gone. The violence in the wash had claimed him, and the stage had carried the proof all the way to Benson. Paul felt a heavy weight settle in his gut. He had brought the silver through, he had saved the team, but he had failed to bring everyone home. The transaction of the night had cost 2 lives. He turned to the station agent. "Bud is gone," he said, his voice flat. "Fell at the wash near Drew's. Shot through the heart. This one here is gone too." The news of Philpott's death rippled through the small crowd that had formed. Philpott was well known, a fixture of the road. Men took off their hats, a reflex of respect and shock. The violence of the territory was a known quantity, but the murder of a stage driver was a direct assault on the community's connection to the outside world. It was an act of war against the infrastructure of their lives. The mood shifted from curiosity to a hard, cold anger. Lanterns were brought closer to the coach, illuminating the bullet holes. Men traced the paths of the projectiles with their fingers, reconstructing the angles of fire. Paul did not stay to answer the barrage of questions. He had one more duty to perform before he could collapse. He pushed away from the coach and walked toward the telegraph office. The building was a small wooden structure adjacent to the station, the hum of the wires a constant background noise. He stepped inside, the air smelling of ozone and stale paper. The operator looked up, startled by Paul's appearance. The messenger was covered in dust, his coat torn, his hands stained with dried blood. "Get the line to Tombstone," Paul ordered, leaning heavily on the counter, "and send one to the main office." The operator nodded, grabbing a pencil and a pad of paper. Paul dictated the message, his mind distilling the chaos of the night into the brevity required by the wire. He stated the facts without embellishment. The stage was attacked. Bud Philpott was killed. Peter Rohrig was killed. The Bullion was safe. The Outlaws had fled. He named the location, the wash south of Drew's station. He described the attackers, 4 men masked, armed with Winchesters. The telegraph key began to click, a rhythmic tapping that converted the tragedy into electrical impulses. Click, clack, click. The sound was mesmerizing. Paul watched the operator's hand, thinking about how those clicks would be received in Tombstone. Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, and the rest of the law enforcement apparatus would be reading these words within minutes. The machinery of justice would begin to turn. Posse would be formed. Horses would be saddled. The hunting of men was about to begin. After the message was sent, Paul walked back out into the night. The crowd around the stage had grown. A doctor had arrived and was examining Rohrig's body, though it was a formality. The undertaker's wagon was already rattling down the street. The silver bullion was being unloaded, the heavy bars carried into the secure room of the station. The men lifting the gold grunted with the weight, the same weight that had slowed the coach and made them a target. The silver looked identical to how it had looked in Tombstone, dull, heavy, indifferent. It had survived the journey without a scratch. Paul looked at the horses. They were being unhitched, led away to the stables. Their heads hung low, their energy spent. They were the true heroes of the escape, biological engines that had outrun death. He walked over to the near-wheeler, the horse that Philpo had fallen under. There was blood on the animal's leg, dark and crusted on the hair. Paul reached out and patted the horse's neck. The animal flinched, then settled, recognizing the touch. It was a small gesture of gratitude in a night devoid of mercy. The station agent handed Paul a cup of whiskey. He took it, his hand shaking slightly as he raised the glass. The liquid burned his throat, a welcome sensation that cut through the numbness. He looked at his hands again. The blood on the ribbons had transferred to his skin, staining the creases of his palms and the beds of his fingernails. He needed to wash it off, but he felt a strange reluctance. It was the last physical connection to Philpott. Washing it away made the death final. A deputy sheriff approached Paul, notebook in hand. "Can you identify them, Bob?" he asked. Paul shook his head slowly. "Masks. They had masks. But I know the build. I know the way they moved. And I know who hangs around that wash. He didn't speak the names yet. Leonard, Head, Crane, King. But the suspicion was already forming in his mind. The list of men capable of this kind of violence was short. The investigation would be a process of elimination, but Paul had a starting point. The passengers were being led to the hotel, their luggage carried by helpful locals. They looked back at the coach one last time, their eyes wide with the trauma of survival. They would tell this story for the rest of their lives, the night they rode the ghost stage to Benson. They were survivors of a historical event, but right now they were just broken people looking for a bed and a bottle. Paul sat down on a bench outside the station office. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard now. His legs felt like lead. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. He could still hear the gunshots, the scream of the wind, the sound of Philpott's body hitting the ground. The auditory hallucinations were loud and persistent. He knew he wouldn't sleep tonight. He would lie in the dark and replay the 10 seconds that had changed everything. The telegraph operator came out, handing Paul a slip of paper. "Reply from Tombstone," he said. Paul took it. The message was brief. A posse was forming. The Earp brothers were mounting up. They would be at the scene by morning. Paul nodded. The response was fast. The law in Tombstone was aggressive, especially when the target was a stagecoach. This wasn't just a robbery, it was an insult to the order they were trying to impose on the frontier. The wind picked up, blowing dust down the street. It rattled the loose boards of the sidewalk. Benson was a quiet town, usually sleeping at this hour. But tonight the lights stayed on. The saloon doors swung open, men pouring out to hear the news. The attempted robbery had failed to take the money, but it had succeeded in waking up the territory. The violence had spilled over from the wild lands into the settlements. Paul looked at the coach again. It sat empty now, a derelict shell. The holes in the side were black eyes staring back at him. It would need repairs, new panels, new glass, new paint. But the wood would always hold the memory of the bullets. It was a scarred veteran just like him. He realized that he would have to get back on a box again, maybe in a few days. He would have to drive this road again. The thought was exhausting. He stood up, his joints popping. He needed to clean up. He needed to file a formal report. He needed to answer more questions. The bureaucracy of death was just beginning. He walked toward the water trough, rolling up his sleeves. He plunged his hands into the cold water, scrubbing at the dried blood. The water turned a pale pink, swirling in the moonlight. He scrubbed until his skin was red and raw, trying to erase the evidence of the struggle. The blood on the ribbons was gone, washed away by the water, but the stain on the night remained. The telegraph wires hummed overhead, carrying the story of the Benson stage to the rest of the world. Bob Paul dried his hands on a rough towel, took a deep breath of the cold desert air, and prepared to step into the next phase of the tragedy. The hunt for the men who had killed his friend. March 16th, 1881. The sun rose over the Dragoon Mountains, casting a harsh, revealing light on the aftermath of the violence committed the night before. The darkness that had shielded the outlaws and obscured the terror of the stagecoach passengers was gone, replaced by the uncompromising clarity of the Arizona morning. In the early hours, a group of riders moved out of Tombstone, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the still air. This was not a random gathering of concerned citizens. It was an instrument of retribution assembled from the most dangerous men in the territory. Virgil Earp, the Deputy United States Marshal, rode at the front, his face set in a grim expression of professional intent. Beside him rode his brothers, Wyatt and Morgan, men whose reputations for violence were already established in the mining camps and cattle towns of the frontier. Joining them were Bat Masterson, a man equally skilled with a firearm, and Bob Paul, who had driven the battered stage into Benson, and immediately returned to the saddle to hunt the men who killed his partner. The posse moved with a speed that punished their mounts, covering the ground between Tombstone and the ambush site at a hard trot. They were heavily armed, carrying Winchester repeating rifles in saddle scabbards and large-caliber revolvers on their hips. Their saddlebags were packed with ammunition and minimal provisions, signaling a readiness for a long pursuit. They did not speak often. The noise of the ride was dominated by the creak of leather, the jingle of bit chains, and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. They were tracking men who had committed a capital offense, and the penalty for such a crime was death, whether by a rope or a bullet. The legal authority they carried was backed by a lethal capability that few outlaw gangs could match. Arriving at the wash near Drew's station, the posse slowed to a walk, their eyes scanning the ground. The scene of the crime was frozen in the geology of the dry creek bed. The tracks of the stagecoach were deeply rutted in the sand, marking the desperate struggle of the team to pull the load up the bank. The soil was churned up where the wheelers had panicked after Philpott fell. The blood of the driver had dried into a dark, crusty stain on the road surface, a biological marker of the exact spot where the murder occurred. Flies were already buzzing around the area, drawn by the scent of death. The men dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel as they began a forensic examination of the kill zone. Virgil Earp walked the perimeter, reading the ground like a text. He found the locations where the ambushers had stood. The brush was trampled, branches broken where men had pushed through to get a clear line of fire. Brass cartridge casings lay scattered in the dirt, the sun glinting off the metal. These were .44 and .45 caliber shells, ejected from Winchester rifles. Virgil picked one up, the metal, still cold from the night. The firing pin impression on the primer was distinct. It was physical evidence that connected a specific weapon to the crime. There were many casings indicating a high volume of fire. The shooters had not been conserving ammunition. They had been trying to shred the driver's box. Bob Paul stood by the bloodstain, his face unreadable. He did not need to analyze the tracks to know what happened. He had lived it. But he pointed out the angles to the others. He showed where the shout had come from, where the muzzle flashes had sparked. The reconstruction of the event confirmed the brutality of the attack. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was an assassination attempt followed by a running battle. The intent had been to kill the driver instantly to stop the coach. The failure of that plan was the only reason the Bullion was safe in Benson. Tracking the fugitives began immediately. The outlaws had fled on foot initially, then mounted horses that had been held nearby. The tracks of the getaway animals were visible in the soft earth beyond the wash. There were 4 distinct sets of hoof prints. The posse mounted up, swinging their horses around to follow the trail. Tracking in this terrain was a difficult science. The ground was hard, often consisting of rock and baked clay that held little impression. But the outlaws had been moving fast, and speed makes for sloppy travel. A galloping horse digs deep, displacing stones and crushing vegetation. The posse followed these signs, their eyes locked on the ground 10 yards ahead of their mounts. The trail led north and east, winding through the scrub brush and avoiding the main roads. The outlaws were heading toward the Dragoon Mountains, a rugged range full of box canyons and hiding spots. The heat of the day began to build, the sun beating down on the riders. They ignored the discomfort, focused entirely on the line of travel. They stopped only to water the horses at natural tanks or springs, allowing the animals a brief respite before pushing on. The endurance of the horses was the limiting factor in the pursuit. If the mounts failed, the hunt failed. As they rode, the tracks told a story of the fugitive's state of mind. The spacing of the hoofprints indicated a panicked flight initially, followed by a slowing down as they put distance between themselves and the scene. They had likely assumed they were safe in the dark, not expecting a posse to be on their tail so quickly. At one point, the trail split. 3 riders went one way and 1 rider went another. This was a classic tactic to confuse pursuers. Virgil Earp had to make a command decision. He studied the tracks. The single rider seemed to be heading toward a known location, a ranch owned by Len Redfield. The other 3 were heading deeper into the wilderness. Virgil signaled to follow the single track. It was the fresher sign, and it led to a place where they could corner a man. The approach to the Redfield Ranch was conducted with tactical caution. The ranch was a collection of rough buildings set in a remote valley, isolated from the nearest neighbors. It was known as a place where questions were not asked and Drifting's men could find a meal and a bed. The posse spread out, forming a skirmish line as they rode toward the main house. They unslung their rifles, resting the stocks on their thighs. They were expecting a fight. If the gang was holed up there, they would likely defend the position with the same violence they had shown at the wash. The ranch yard was quiet as they entered. A dog barked, a sharp warning sound that brought a man to the door of the main cabin. It was not one of the shooters, it was a ranch hand. He looked at the line of heavily armed men and slowly raised his hands, signaling he wanted no part of the trouble. Virgil rode forward, his voice commanding. He asked who was on the property. The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the barn. That hesitation was all the confirmation the posse needed. They spurred their horses toward the Outlaws' likely cover. Inside the barn, the shadows were deep. The smell of hay and manure was thick. The posse dismounted and moved in on foot, their boots silent in the straw. They checked the stalls, weapons raised. In the rear of the barn, they found a man trying to hide behind a stack of feed sacks. It was Luther King. He was not a hardened gunman like the others. He was a fringe operator, a man often used for menial tasks in the criminal ecosystem. He looked up at the barrels of the Winchesters leveled at his chest and realized his run was over. He did not reach for a weapon. He surrendered, his hands trembling as he raised them above his head. The arrest was physical and immediate. 2 of the posse members grabbed King, dragging him out of the shadows and into the sunlight of the yard. They patted him down, removing a pistol from his belt and a knife from his boot. They checked his pockets, finding cartridges that matched the casings found at the scene. King was sweating, his face pale beneath the grime. He was a man out of his depth, caught in the gears of a machine he didn't understand. The posse pushed him against the wall of the barn, surrounding him. The interrogation began on the spot. Virgil Earp leaned in close, his presence overwhelming. He did not shout. He spoke in a low, hard tone that promised consequences. He asked where the others were. He asked who had pulled the trigger. King stammered, his eyes shifting from one lawman to another. He saw no sympathy in their faces. Bob Paul stood nearby, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The visual reminder of the victim's partner was a powerful psychological lever. King knew that these men were not bound by the polite procedures of a courtroom. They were in the middle of nowhere, and they wanted answers. The evidence against King was solidified by the discovery of his horse in the corral. The animal was ridden hard, its coat matted with dried sweat and dust. Its shoes matched the tracks they had followed from the split in the trail. There was no denying the connection. King had ridden from the scene of the murder to this ranch. The timeline fit perfectly. Faced with the physical proof and the terrifying demeanor of the Earp brothers, King's resistance crumbled. He began to talk. He admitted to being there. He admitted to holding the horses, but he distanced himself from the shooting. He claimed he didn't fire a shot. He gave up the names of the others, Bill Leonard, Harry Head, and Jim Crane. He described the plan, how they had waited in the wash, how they had expected the driver to stop. He painted himself as a reluctant participant, a man dragged along by more violent associates. The confession was a torrent of words, a desperate attempt to trade information for leniency. The posse listened, memorizing the names. Leonard, Head, Crane. These were known men, cowboys and drifters who hung around the edges of the Clanton and McClory operations. The identification of the shooters changed the nature of the hunt. It was no longer a search for unknown assailants. It was a targeted pursuit of specific individuals. The lawmen knew who they were looking for now. They knew their faces, their habits, and their associates. King was bound, his hands tied behind his back with a length of rope. He was hoisted onto his horse, his ankles secured beneath the animal's belly to prevent escape. He was now a prisoner of the territory, a piece of evidence that could hang the others. The posse prepared to move out. They had one man, but three were still loose in the mountains. The sun was high overhead now, the day turning hot and dry. The men took a drink from their canteens, washing the dust from their throats. The return trip to Tombstone was a slow procession. King rode in the center of the group, surrounded by the posse. He slumped in the saddle, defeated. The adrenaline of the capture had faded, replaced by the grim reality of his situation. He was facing a murder charge. In the Arizona territory, being an accomplice to a robbery that resulted in death carried the same penalty as pulling the trigger. He looked at the backs of the men riding ahead of him. They sat tall in the saddle, their posture radiating confidence and authority. They had done their job. They had closed the loop on one part of the crime. As they rode, Bob Paul dropped back to ride alongside King. He looked at the prisoner with a cold curiosity. He wanted to know why. Why kill Philpott? Why shoot a man who was just doing his job? King wouldn't meet his eyes. He stared at the horse's mane, muttering that it wasn't supposed to happen like that. It was supposed to be easy. Paul turned away, disgusted. There was no satisfactory answer. Greed and incompetence had combined to create a tragedy. The posse reached the outskirts of Tombstone as the afternoon wore on. The town was buzzing with rumors. The news of the stage attack had spread, and the arrival of the lawman with a prisoner drew a crowd. People poured out of the saloons and stores to watch the procession. They pointed at King, whispering his name. The sight of the captured outlaw was a reassurance that the law could strike back. It was a public display of the power of the Earp faction. They rode straight to the jail. Sheriff Johnny Bullion was there to meet them. Bullion was the political rival of the Earps, a man who walked a fine line between the law and the outlaw element. The tension between the two groups was palpable. Virgil Earp formally handed the prisoner over to Bullion. The transfer of custody was a bureaucratic necessity, but it was fraught with distrust. The Earps had done the work. Now the sheriff would hold the prize. Virgil warned Bullion to watch him closely. King was the key to the whole case. If he talked in court, he could bring down the whole gang. King was led into the jail, the heavy iron door slamming shut behind him. The sound echoed in the street. He was secure for the moment, locked in a cell with stone walls and barred windows. The posse dismounted, stretching their stiff legs. They dusted off their coats, checking their weapons. The hunt for the day was over, but the work was not done. They still had 3 men to catch. The capture of Luther King was a significant victory. It provided the names and the narrative of the crime. It proved that the system could function, that a crime committed in the dark wash could be solved in the light of day. But there was an undercurrent of unease. King was a weak man, a man who could be manipulated. He was now in the custody of a sheriff who had complex alliances. The security of the prisoner was not guaranteed. Bob Paul walked away from the jail, heading toward the Wells Fargo office. He needed to update the company. He had the names now. The company detectives would be unleashed. The reward money would be posted. The pressure on Leonard, Head, and Crane would be immense. They would be hunted not just by the law but by every man looking for a payday. The sun began to set, painting the sky in the same bruise-colored hues as the evening before. It had been 24 hours since the stage rolled out of Tombstone. In that time, 2 men had died, 1 man had been captured, and the territory had moved a step closer to open warfare between the law and the lawless. The capture of King was the opening move in a legal chess game that would turn violent and chaotic. The posse disbanded for the night, heading to their homes or to the saloons to wash the dust from their throats. They were tired, their bodies aching from the miles in the saddle. They had performed their duty with ruthless efficiency. They had gone into the Badlands and brought back a man. It was a validation of their methods. But as they drank their whiskey, they knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The 3 shooters were still out there, armed and desperate, and Luther, King, sitting in his cell, was a loose end that many powerful people would want to see silenced or removed. The silence of the jail cell settled around Luther King. He sat on the cot, his head in his hands. He could still hear the voice of Virgil Earp, the questions, the threats. He knew he had betrayed his friends. He knew he was a marked man. Outside, the town of Tombstone continued its raucous existence, the piano music and laughter drifting through the barred window. King was alone with his choices, waiting for the next turn of the screw. He did not know that his time in the cell would be short, and that the door of justice had a back exit that was already being unlocked by the corruption of the county. March 19th, 1881. The Cochise County Jail in Tombstone was a structure designed to contain the physical bodies of men, but it possessed no mechanism to contain the corruption that permeated the soil of the territory. Luther King sat within the confines of this institution, a man suspended between the certainty of a hangman's noose and the uncertainty of a vigilante's bullet. He had been in custody for 3 days, a period marked by intense interrogation and the silent, crushing pressure of his own choices. He had named names. He had identified Bill Leonard, Harry Head, and Jim Crane as the men who murdered Bud Philpott. By speaking these names to the Earp posse, he had purchased a temporary reprieve from immediate execution, but he had also signed a warrant for his own death in the eyes of the outlaw element that controlled the rural darkness of the county. The jail cell was a small, stone-walled box that smelled of unwashed bodies, damp mortar, and the lingering acridity of chloride of lime used to suppress the stench of the waste bucket. King sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his hands clasping and unclasping between his knees. He was not a hardened killer like the men he had ridden with. He was an accomplice, a holder of horses, a man who had drifted into a capital crime through a combination of bad company and weak will. Now the reality of his situation was a physical weight on his chest. He was the linchpin in the prosecution's case. Without his testimony, the identification of the shooters relied on the visual memory of Bob Paul in a dark wash. With his testimony, the territory could legally hang 3 men. Sheriff Johnny Behan controlled the keys to the cell. Behan was a man of complex alliances, a political creature who navigated the treacherous waters between the business interests of Tombstone and the cattle interests of the countryside. To the Earps and the Wells Fargo agents, King was a witness to be protected at all costs. To Behan and his constituents, King was a liability, a loose thread that could unravel a tapestry of illicit beef sales, stage robberies, and political favors. The tension between these 2 viewpoints created a peculiar atmosphere inside the sheriff's office. The prisoner was not treated with the rigor usually reserved for a confessed accessory to murder. There were no leg irons riveted to his ankles. The guard details were relaxed, often delegated to men who shared more cultural affinity with the prisoner than with the prosecutors. On this Saturday afternoon, the administrative machinery of the law provided the pretext for the events that would follow. Luther King had a need for legal counsel. To pay for a lawyer, he needed to liquidate his only asset, the horse he had ridden to the ambush and subsequently to the Redfield Ranch. A bill of sale had to be drawn up, notarized, and witnessed. This bureaucratic necessity required King to be moved from the secure cell to the front office of the jail, a space separated from the street by only a standard wooden door and a storefront window. Harry Woods, the undersheriff and the editor of the Nugget newspaper, was present in the office. Woods was a man who wielded a pen as effectively as a pistol, shaping the narrative of the town to suit the anti-ERP faction. He oversaw the transaction. King was brought out of the cell, blinking in the brighter light of the office. The room smelled of ink, stale cigar smoke, and dust. It was a clerical space filled with filing cabinets, wanted posters, and a heavy oak desk where the business of the county was transacted. King was directed to sit at the desk to sign the documents transferring ownership of his mount to John Dunbar, Sheriff Behan's partner in the Dexter livery stable. The atmosphere in the office was casually unprofessional. The strict protocols of custody were suspended in favor of a relaxed familiarity. King was not handcuffed to the chair. He was not surrounded by deputies with drawn weapons. He was treated as a man conducting a business deal, rather than a felon facing a murder charge. The pen scratched against the paper, the sound loud in the quiet room. King signed his name, the ink flowing onto the fiber of the document, finalizing the sale. He handed the pen back to the clerk, his eyes darting around the room. He was looking for the opportunities that desperation reveals to the trapped. The layout of the office was simple. The main entrance opened onto the street where the bustle of Tombstone provided a constant acoustic backdrop. A rear door led to an alleyway, a narrow corridor of shadow that ran behind the buildings. This rear door was the threshold between custody and liberty. In a facility dedicated to confinement, the security of the perimeter is the primary directive. Yet on this specific afternoon, the directive was ignored. The rear door was not bolted. It was not guarded. It stood as a silent invitation, a wooden slab that relied on the honor system to keep a prisoner inside. The exact choreography of the escape was so simple it bordered on farce. While the attention of the undersheriff and the clerk was ostensibly directed toward the paperwork or a conversation that conveniently turned their eyes away from the prisoner, Luther King stood up. He did not run. He did not assault a guard. He simply utilized the absence of restraint. He walked across the wooden floorboards, his boots making a sound that should have triggered a reaction but did not. He reached for the handle of the back door, turned it, and stepped out into the alley. The transition from prisoner to fugitive took less than 5 seconds. King closed the door behind him, the latch clicking softly. He was now standing in the dusty alley behind the jail. The air tasted of freedom and horse manure. According to the rumors that would circulate within the hour, a horse was waiting for him, saddled and ready, tied to a rail just yards away. This was not a coincidence. It was a logistical arrangement that implied coordination. King mounted the horse, gathered the reins, and rode away at a casual trot, blending into the traffic of the town before turning toward the open desert. Inside the office, a period of time elapsed before the alarm was raised. The length of this delay was a matter of dispute. Some claimed it was immediate, others claimed it was 10 minutes or more. When the shout finally went up that the prisoner was gone, it was a performance of theatrical incompetence. Deputies rushed out the front door, looking up and down the main street while the dust of King's departure was already settling in the alley behind them. They checked the saloons, they checked the corrals, but they did not ride with the fury that the ERP posse had shown 2 days prior. The pursuit was lethargic, a token effort to satisfy the appearance of duty. News of the escape hit the streets of Tombstone like a physical blow. Bob Paul, Virgil Earp, and the Wells Fargo agents received the information with a mixture of disbelief and incandescent rage. They had ridden their horses into the ground, risked their lives in a canyon hunt, and dragged the man back to face justice, only to have him walk out the back door of the sheriff's office while the lawmen inside were pushing paper. The sheer audacity of the event stripped away the veneer of civilization that the town tried to maintain. It was a declaration that the institutions of the county were not just flawed, they were actively working against the interests of the federal marshals and the express companies. Virgil Earp stormed into the sheriff's office, his presence filling the room with the threat of violence. He demanded answers. He wanted to know how a man who had confessed to being an accomplice in a double homicide could simply vanish from a secure facility. The explanations offered by Bullion and Woods were vague, centered on administrative errors and momentary distractions. They shrugged their shoulders, presenting the escape as an unfortunate mishap rather than a calculated release. To Virgil, the open door was not a mistake. It was a message. It said that the cowboys were protected, that the law only applied to those without friends in high places. The escape of Luther King destroyed the prosecution's case against Leonard, Head, and Crane. Without the corroborating testimony of the accomplice, the legal ground for pursuing them weakened. The warrants remained, but the certainty of a conviction evaporated. King had been the bridge between the crime and the punishment, and that bridge had been burned. The three shooters were now free to disappear into the vastness of the territory, protected by the silence of their peers and the incompetence of the authorities. The silver bullion was safe in the vault, but the blood of Bud Philpott and Peter Roerig demanded a reckoning that the legal system was now powerless to provide. Bob Paul stood outside the Wells Fargo office, watching the sun lower toward the horizon. The same sun had set on the ambush, on the chase, on the capture, and now it set on the failure of justice. He realized that the war for the territory would not be fought in the courtrooms. The books and the statutes were useless if the men holding the keys were corrupt. The conflict had moved beyond the stage of criminal investigation. It was becoming a personal vendetta between the men who stood for order and the men who thrived in chaos. The escape confirmed the suspicions of the business owners and the citizens who relied on the stage lines. They saw that the county government was unable or unwilling to protect them. This realization hardened the lines of division in the town. The Law and Order Party, backed by the Epitaph newspaper and the Earps, began to view the sheriff's office not as a rival agency, but as an enemy combatant. The rhetoric in the papers became vitriolic. The Epitaph screamed about the jail delivery and the disgrace of the county, while the Nugget downplayed the event, focusing on the lack of hard evidence against King. Luther King rode south, heading for the Mexican border or the deep ranges of the Pelanchillo Mountains. He was a small man in a large landscape, a pawn that had been played and removed from the board. He would fade from history, a footnote in the larger saga of the Tombstone Troubles. He would survive the immediate aftermath, unlike the men he had named. Leonard, Head, and Crane would eventually meet violent ends, killed in disputes over other crimes, but they would not hang for the Benson stage job. The rope that had been braided for them was left coiling on the floor of the jail. The psychological impact on Bob Paul was profound. He had done everything right. He had fought back against overwhelming odds, he had saved the cargo, and he had identified the killers. He had operated within the rules of the system. The system had responded by opening the back door for the criminal. This betrayal by the machinery of the state taught him a lesson that would inform his future actions as a lawman. He learned that a badge was just a piece of metal. The only true authority came from the willingness to enforce the law personally, with a shotgun if necessary. Night settled over Tombstone, bringing with it the usual sounds of the saloons and the gambling halls. The piano music tinkled into the street, mocking the gravity of the day's events. The town continued its frantic pursuit of wealth, indifferent to the moral collapse that had just occurred. The silver mines were still producing, the stages were still running, and the whiskey was still flowing. But beneath the surface, the structural integrity of the community had cracked. The trust between the citizens and the sheriff was broken. The Benson stage robbery would go down in the ledgers as a failed attempt. The loss was recorded as $0 in bullion, but the true cost was not financial. The cost was the erosion of the belief that justice was possible in the Arizona territory. The open door of the jail showed the world that the outlaw element had infiltrated the very institutions designed to stop them. It was a victory for the men in the shadows, a demonstration of their power to nullify the efforts of honest men. In the days that followed, the search for King continued in a desultory fashion. But everyone knew he was gone. The tracks had been swept away by the wind. The posse disbanded, the men returning to their daily lives with a bitter taste in their mouths. They had touched the face of the problem, looked it in the eye, and watched it walk away laughing. The frustration built up like pressure in a steam boiler waiting for a release valve. The murder of Bud Philpott became a ghost story, a tale told to new drivers to warn them of the dangers of the road. But for the men who had ridden in the posse, it was an unfinished chapter. They carried the memory of the dead driver and the escaped prisoner as a debt that had to be paid. The violence that had started in the wash near Drew's station did not end with King's escape. It merely changed shape, growing larger and more toxic, feeding the animosity that would eventually explode on the streets of Tombstone a few months later. The legacy of March 19th was the death of compromise. There could be no middle ground when the law itself was a participant in the crime. The lines were drawn in the dust of the jailhouse alley. On one side stood the Earps and the interests of the federal government. On the other stood the cowboys and the county sheriff. The escape of Luther King was the point of no return. It was the moment when the possibility of a peaceful resolution to the conflict vanished, replaced by the certainty of future bloodshed. Bob Paul eventually returned to his duties, climbing back onto the box of the stagecoach. He took the reins in his scarred hands, checked his shotgun, and drove out into the desert night. He drove past the place where Philpott died, past the wash where the ambush happened. He drove with the knowledge that the men who killed his friend were still out there, breathing the same air. He drove with a new hardness in his eyes, a grim acceptance that in the Wild West, justice was not something you were given by a court. It was something you had to carry with you, loaded in the chambers of a weapon. The open door of the Tombstone jail remained a symbol of the failure of 1881. It was a physical manifestation of the corruption that ruled the territory. It stood as a silent witness to the fact that in a land without law, the only truth was power, and the only justice was the one you made for yourself. The bullion had been saved, but the soul of the town had been stolen, carried away into the night by a horse thief who walked out of the unlocked door.